Chapter 16 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice THOMPSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 16. Father Béret's Old Battle. The room in which Alice was now imprisoned formed part of the upper story of a building erected by Hamilton in one of the four angles of the stockade. It had no windows and but two oblong portholes made to accommodate a small swivel which stood darkly scowling near the middle of the floor. From one of these apertures Alice could see the straggling roofs and fences of the dreary little town, while from the other a long reach of watery prairie, almost a lake, lay under view with the rolling, muddy Wabash gleaming beyond. There seemed to be no activity of garrison or townspeople. Few sounds broke the silence of which the cheerless prison room seemed to be the centre. Alice felt all her courage and cheerfulness leaving her. She was alone in the midst of enemies. No father or mother, no friend, a young girl at the mercy of soldiers who could not be expected to regard her with any sympathy beyond that which is accompanied with repulsive leers and hints. Day after day her loneliness and helplessness became more agonizing. Farnsworth, it is true, did all he could to relieve the strain of her situation, but Hamilton had an eye upon what passed, and soon interfered. He administered a bitter reprimand, under which his subordinate writhed in speechless anger and resentment. "Finally, Captain Farnsworth," he said in conclusion, "you will distinctly understand that this girl is my prisoner, not yours. That I, not you, will direct how she is to be held and treated, and that hereafter I will suffer no interference on your part. I hope you fully understand me, sir, and will govern yourself accordingly." Smarting, or rather smothering, under the outrageous insult of these remarks, Farnsworth at first determined to fling his resignation at the governor's feet and then do whatever desperate thing seemed most to his mood. But a soldier's training is apt to call a halt before the worst befalls in such a case. Moreover, in the present temptation Farnsworth had a special check and hindrance. He had had a conference with Father Beret, in which the good priest had played the part of wisdom in slippers, and of gentleness more dove-like than the doves. A very subtle impression, illuminated with the "hope that withers hope," had become of that interview, and now Farnsworth felt its restraint. He therefore saluted Hamilton formally and walked away. Father Beret's paternal love for Alice — we cannot characterize it more nicely than to call it paternal — was his justification for a certain mild sort of corruption insinuated by him into the heart of Farnsworth. He was a crafty priest, but his craft was always used for a good end. Unquestionably Jesuitic was his mode of circumventing the young man's military scruples, by offering him a puff of fair weather with which to sail toward what appeared to be the shore of delight. He saw at a glance that Farnsworth's love for Alice was a consuming passion in a very ardent yet decidedly weak heart. Here was the worldly lever with which Father Beret hoped to raise Alice's prison and free her from the terrible doom with which she was threatened. The first interview was at Father Beret's cabin, to which, as will be remembered, the priest and Farnsworth went after their meeting in the street. It actually came to nothing, save an indirect understanding but half suggested by Father Beret and never openly sanctioned by Captain Farnsworth. The talk was insinuating on the part of the former, while the latter slipped evasively from every proposition, as if not able to consider it on account of a curious obtuseness of perception. Still, when they separated they shook hands and exchanged a searching look perfectly satisfactory to both. The memory of that interview with the priest was in Farnsworth's mind when, boiling with rage, he left Hamilton's presence and went forth into the chill February air. He passed out through the postern and along the sodden and queechy edge of the prairie, involuntarily making his way to Father Beret's cabin. His indignation was so great that he trembled from head to foot at every step. The door of the place was open, and Father Beret was eating a frugal meal of scones and sour wine, of his own make, he said, which he hospitably begged to share with his visitor. A fire smouldered on the hearth, and a flat stone showed, by the grease smoking over its hot surface, where the cakes had been baked. "Come in, my son," said the priest, "and try the fare of a poor old man. It is plain, very plain, but good." He smacked his lips sincerely and fingered another scone. "Take some, take some." Farnsworth was not tempted. The acid bouquet of the wine filled the room with a smack of vinegar, and the smoke from rank scorching fat and wheatmeal did not suggest an agreeable feast. Well, well, if you are not hungry, my son, sit down on the stool there, and tell me the news." Farnsworth took the low seat without a word, letting his eyes wander over the walls. Alice's rapier, that mate to that now worn by Hamilton, hung in its curiously engraved scabbard near one corner. The sight of it inflamed Farnsworth. "It's an outrage," he broke forth. "Governor Hamilton sent a man to Roussillon Place with orders to bring him the scabbard of Miss Roussillon's sword, and he now wears the beautiful weapon as if he had come by it honestly. Damn him!" "My dear, dear son, you must not soil your lips with such language." Father Beret let fall the half of a well-bitten cake and held up both hands. "I beg your pardon, father. I know I ought to be more careful in your presence. But, the beastly hellish scoundrel—" "Bah, doucement, mon fils, doucement." The old man shook his head and his finger while speaking. "Easy, my son, easy. You would be a fine target for bullets were your words to reach Hamilton's ears. You are not permitted to revile your commander." "Yes, I know. But how can a man restrain himself under such abominable conditions?" Father Beret shrewdly guessed that Hamilton had been giving the captain fresh reason for bitter resentment. Moreover, he was sure that the moving cause had been Alice. So in order to draw out what he wished to hear, he said very gently, "How is the little prisoner getting along?" Farnsworth ground his teeth and swore. But Father Beret appeared not to hear. He bit deep into a scone, took a liberal sip of the muddy red wine, and added, "Has she a comfortable place? Do you think Governor Hamilton would let me visit her?" "It is horrible," Farnsworth blurted. "She's penned up as if she were a dangerous beast, the poor girl. And that damned scoundrel—" "Son, son!" "Oh, it's no use to try. I can't help it, father. The whelp—" "We can converse more safely and intelligently if we avoid profanity and undue emotion, my son. Now, if you will quit swearing, I will, and if you will be calm, so will I." Farnsworth felt the sly irony of this absurdly vicarious proposition. Father Beret smiled with a kindly twinkle in his deep-set eyes. "Well, if you don't use profane language, father, there's no telling how much you think in expletives. What is your opinion of a man who tumbles a poor defenseless girl into prison, and then refuses to let her be decently cared for? How do you express yourself about him?" "My son, men often do things of which they ought to be ashamed. I heard of a young officer once who maltreated a little girl that he met at night in the street. What evil he would have done had not a passing kind-hearted man reminded him of his honor by a friendly punch in the ribs, I dare not surmise." "True, and your sarcasm goes home as hard as your fist did, father. I know that I've been a sad dog all my life. Miss Roussillon saved you by shooting me, and I love her for it. Lay it on, father. I deserve more than you can give me." "Surely you do, my son. Surely you do. But my love for you will not let me give you pain. Ah, we priests have to carry all men's loads. Our backs are broad, however, very broad, my son." "And your fists devilish heavy, father, devilish heavy." The gentle smile again flickered over the priest's weather-beaten face as he glanced sideways at Farnsworth and said, Sometimes, my son, a carnal weapon must break the way for a spiritual one. But we priests rarely have much physical strength. Our dependence is upon—" "To be sure, certainly," Farnsworth interrupted, rubbing his side. "Your dependence is upon the first thing that offers. I've had many a blow, but yours was the solidest that ever jarred my mortal frame, Father Beret." The twain began to laugh. There is nothing like a reminiscence to stir up fresh mutual sympathy. "If your intercostals were somewhat sore for a time on account of a contact with priestly knuckles, doubtless there soon set in a corresponding uneasiness in the region of your conscience. Such shocks are often vigorously alterative and tonic, my son?" "You jolted me sober, father, and then I was ashamed of myself. But where does all your tremendous strength lie? You don't look strong." While speaking, Farnsworth leaned near Father Perret and grasped his arm. The young man started, for his fingers, instead of closing around a flabby, shrunken old man's limb, spread themselves upon a huge, knotted mass of iron muscles. With a quick movement, Father Perret shook off Farnsworth's hand and said, "I am no Samson, my son. Non sum qualis eram." Then, as if dismissing a light subject for a graver one, he sighed and added, "I suppose there is nothing that can be done for little Alice." He called the tall, strong girl little Alice, and so she seemed to him. He could not, without direct effort, think of her as a magnificently maturing woman. She had always been his spoiled pet child, perversely set against the Holy Church, but dear to him nevertheless. "I came to ask you that very question, Father," said Farnsworth. "And what do I know? Surely, my son, you see how utterly helpless an old priest is against all you British. And besides—" "Father Perret," Farnsworth huskily interrupted, "is there a place that you know of anywhere in which Miss Roussillon could be hidden if—" "My dear son—" "But, Father, I mean it." "Mean what? Pardon an old man's slow understanding. What are you talking about, my son?" Father Perret glanced furtively about, then quickly stepped through the doorway, walked entirely around the house, and came in again before Farnsworth could respond. Once more seated on his stool, he added interrogatively, "Did you think you heard something moving outside?" "No." "You were saying something when I went out. Pardon my interruption." Farnsworth gave the priest a searching and not wholly confiding look. "You did not interrupt me, Father Perret. I was not speaking. Why are you so watchful? Are you afraid of eavesdroppers?" "You were speaking recklessly. Your words were incendiary. Ardentia verba. My son, you were suggesting a dangerous thing. Your life would scarcely satisfy the law were you convicted of insinuating such treason. What if one of your prowling guards had overheard you? Your neck and mine might feel the halter. Quod avertat Dominus." He crossed himself, and in a solemn voice added in English, "May the Lord forbid. Ah, my son, we priests protect those we love." "And I, who am not fit to tie a priest's shoe, do likewise. Father, I love Alice Roussillon." "Love is a holy thing, my son. Amare divinum est et humanum." "Father Perret, can you help me?" "Spiritually speaking, my son." "I mean, can you hide Mademoiselle Roussillon in some safe place if I take her out of the prison yonder? That's just what I mean. Can you do it?" "Your question is a remarkable one. Have you thought upon it from all directions, my son? Think of your position, your duty as an officer." A shrewd, polemical expression beamed from Father Perret's eyes, and a very expert physiognomist might have suspected duplicity from certain lines about the old man's mouth. "I simply know that I cannot stand by and see Alice, Mademoiselle Roussillon, forced to suffer treatment too beastly for an Indian chief. That's the only direction there is for me to look at it from, and you can understand my feelings if you will. You know that very well, Father Perret. When a man loves a girl, he loves her. That's the whole thing." The quiet, inscrutable half smile flickered once more on Father Perret's face, but he sat silent some time with a sinewy forefinger lying alongside his nose. When at last he spoke, it was in a tone of voice indicative of small interest in what he was saying. His words rambled to their goal with the effect of happy accident. "There are places in this neighborhood in which a human being would be as hard to find as the flag that you and Governor Hamilton have so diligently and unsuccessfully been in quest of for the past month or two. Really, my son, this is a mysterious little town." Farnsworth's eyes widened, and a flush rose in his swarthy cheeks. "Damn the flag!" he exclaimed. "Let it lie hidden forever. What do I care? I tell you, Father Perret, that Alice Roussillon is in extreme danger. Governor Hamilton means to put some terrible punishment on her. He has a devil's vindictiveness. He showed it to me clearly a while ago." You showed something of the same sort to me once upon a time, my son." "Yes, I did, Father Beret, and I got a load of slugs in my shoulder for it from that brave girl's pistol. She saved your life. Now I ask you to help me save hers; or if not her life, what is infinitely more, her honour." "Her honour!" cried Father Beret, leaping to his feet so suddenly and with such energy that the cabin shook from base to roof. "What do you say, Captain Farnsworth? What do you mean?" The old man was transformed. His face was terrible to see, with its narrow burning eyes deep under the shaggy brows, its dark veins writhing snake-like on the temples and forehead, the projected mouth and chin, the hard lines of the jaws, the iron-gray gleam from all the features. He looked like an aged tiger stiffened for a spring. Farnsworth was made of right soldierly stuff, but he felt a distinct shiver flit along his back. His past life had not lacked thrilling adventures and strangely varied experiences with desperate men. Usually he met sudden emergencies rather calmly, sometimes with phlegmatic indifference. This passionate outburst on the priest's part, however, surprised him and awed him, while it stirred his heart with a profound sympathy unlike anything he had ever felt before. Father Beret mastered himself in a moment, and passing his hand over his face, as if to brush away the excitement, sat down again on his stool. He appeared to collapse inwardly. "You must excuse the weakness of an old man, my son," he said in a voice hoarse and shaking. "But tell me, what is going to be done with Alice? Your words, what you said, I did not understand." He rubbed his forehead slowly, as one who has difficulty in trying to collect his thoughts. "I do not know what Governor Hamilton means to do, Father Beret. It will be something devilish, however, something that must not happen," said Farnsworth. Then he recounted all that Hamilton had done and said. He described the dreary and comfortless room in which Alice was confined, the miserable fare given her, and how she would be exposed to the leers and low remarks of the soldiers. She had already suffered these things, and now she could no longer have any protection. What was to become of her? He did not attempt to overstate the case, but presented it with a blunt sincerity which made a powerful, realistic impression. Father Beret, like most men of strong feeling who have been subjected to long years of trial, hardship, multitudinous dangers and all sorts of temptation, and who have learned the lessons of self-control, had an iron will, and also an abiding distrust of weak men. He saw Farnsworth's sincerity, but he had no faith in his constancy, although satisfied that while resentment of Hamilton's imperiousness lasted, he would doubtless remain firm in his purpose to aid Alice. Let that wear off, as in a short time it would, and then what? The old man studied his companion with eyes that slowly resumed their expression of smouldering and almost timid geniality. His priestly experience with desperate men was demanding of him a proper regard for that subtlety of procedure which had so often compassed most difficult ends. He listened in silence to Farnsworth's story. When it came to an end, he began to offer some but half-relevant suggestions in the form of indirect cross-questions, by means of which he gradually drew out a minute description of Alice's prison, the best way to reach it, the nature of its door fastenings, where the key was kept, and everything indeed likely to be helpful to one contemplating a jail delivery. Farnsworth was inwardly delighted. He felt Father Beret's cunning approach to the central object and his crafty method of gathering details. The shades of evening thickened in the stuffy cabin room while the conversation went on. Father Beret presently lifted a puncheon in one corner of the floor and got out a large bottle which bore a mildewed and faded French label, and with it a small iron cup. There was just light enough left to show a brownish sparkle when, after popping out the cork, he poured a draught in the fresh cup and in his own. "We may think more clearly, my son, if we taste this old liquor. I have kept it a long while to offer upon a proper occasion. The occasion is here." A ravishing bouquet quickly imbued the air. It was itself an intoxication. "The brothers of Saint Martin distilled this liquor," Father Beret added, handing the cup to Farnsworth, "not for common social drinking, my son, but for times when a man needs extraordinary stimulation. It is said to be surpassingly good, because Saint Martin blessed the vine." The doughty captain felt a sudden and imperious thirst seize his throat. The liquor flooded his veins before his lips touched the cup. He had been abstaining lately. Now his besetting appetite rushed upon him. At one gulp he took in the fiery yet smooth and captivating draught. Nor did he notice that Father Beret, instead of joining him in the potation, merely lifted his cup and set it down again, smacking his lips with gusto. There followed a silence during which the aromatic breath of the bottle increased its dangerous fascination. Then Father Beret again filled Farnsworth's cup and said, "Ah, the blessed monks little thought that their matchless brew would ever be sipped in a poor missionary's hut on the Wabash. But after all, my son, why not here as well as in sunny France? Our object justifies any impropriety of time and place." "You are right, Father. I drink to our object. Yes, I say, to our object." In fact, the drinking preceded his speech, and his tongue already had a loop in it. The liquor stole through him, a mist of bewildering and enchanting influence. The third cup broke his sentences into unintelligible fragments, the fourth made his underjaw sag loosely, the fifth and sixth, taken in close succession, tumbled him limp on the floor, where he slept blissfully all night long, snugly covered with some of Father Beret's bedclothes. "Per casum obliquum et per indirectum," muttered the priest, when he had returned the bottle and cup to their hiding place. "The end justifies the means. Sleep well, my son. Ah, little Alice, your old father will try. He fumbled along the wall in the dark until he found the rapier, which he took down. Then he went out and sat for some time motionless beside the door, while the clouds thickened overhead. It was late when he arose and glided away shadow-like toward the fort, over which the night hung black, chill, and drearily silent. The moon was still some hours high, but smothered by the clouds. A fog slowly drifted from the river. Meantime Hamilton and Helm had spent a part of the afternoon and evening, as usual, at cards. Helm broke off the game and went to his quarters rather early for him, leaving the governor alone and in a bad temper because Farnsworth, when he had sent for him, could not be found. 3 times his orderly returned in as many hours with the same report: the captain had not been seen or heard of. Naturally, this sudden and complete disappearance immediately after the reprimand suggested to Hamilton an unpleasant possibility. What if Farnsworth had deserted him? Down deep in his heart he was conscious that the young man had good cause for almost any desperate action. To lose Captain Farnsworth, however, would be just now a calamity. The Indians were drifting over rapidly to the side of the Americans, and every day showed that the French could not long be kept quiet. Hamilton sat for some time after Helm's departure thinking over what he now feared was a foolish mistake. Presently he buckled on Alice's rapier, which he had lately been wearing as his own, and went out into the main area of the stockade. A sentinel was tramping to and fro at the gate, where a hazy lantern shone. The night was breathless and silent. Hamilton approached the soldier on duty, and asked him if he had seen Captain Farnsworth, and receiving a negative reply, turned about, puzzled and thoughtful, to walk back and forth in the chill, foggy air. Presently a faint yellow light attracted his attention. It shone through a porthole in an upper room of the blockhouse at the farther angle of the stockade. In fact, Alice was reading by a sputtering lamp a book Farnsworth had sent her, a volume of Ronsard that he had picked up in Canada. Hamilton made his way in that direction, at first merely curious to know who was burning oil so late; but after a few paces he recognized where the light came from, and instantly suspected that Captain Farnsworth was there. Indeed, he felt sure of it. Somehow he could not regard Alice as other than a saucy hoyden, incapable of womanly virtue. His experience with the worst element of Canadian French life, and his peculiar cast of mind and character, colored his impression of her. He measured her by the women with whom the coureurs de bois and half-breed trappers consorted in Detroit and at the posts eastward to Quebec. Alice, unable to sleep, had sought forgetfulness of her bitter captivity in the old poet's charming lyrics. She sat on the floor, some blankets and furs drawn around her, the book on her lap, the stupidly dull lamp hanging beside her on a part of the swivel. Her hair lay loose over her neck and shoulders, and shimmered around her face with a cloud-like effect, giving to the features in their repose a setting that intensified their sweetness and sadness. In a very low but distinct voice she was reading with a slightly quavering emotion, Mignonne, allons voir si la rose, que ce matin à voix d'éclose, sa robe de pourpre au soleil. When Hamilton, after stealthily mounting the rough stairway which led to her door, peeped in through a space between the slabs and felt a stroke of disappointment, seeing at a glance that Farnsworth was not there. He gazed for some time, not without a sense of villainy, while she continued her sweetly monotonous reading. If his heart had been as hard as the iron swivel balls that lay beside Alice, he must still have felt a thrill of something like tender sympathy. She now showed no trace of the vivacious sauciness which had heretofore always marked her features when she was in his presence. A dainty gentleness, touched with melancholy, gave to her face an appealing look all the more powerful on account of its unconscious simplicity of expression. The man felt an impulse pure and noble which would have borne him back down the ladder and away from the building, had not a stronger one set boldly in the opposite direction. There was a short struggle with the seared remnant of his better nature, and then he tried to open the door. But it was locked. Alice heard the slight noise, and breaking off her reading, turned to look. Hamilton made another effort to enter before he recollected that the wooden key, or notched lever, that controlled the cumbrous wooden lock, hung on a peg beside the door. He felt for it along the wall, and soon laid his hand on it. Then again he peeped through to see Alice, who was now standing upright near the swivel. She had thrown her hair back from her face and neck. The lamp's flickering light seemed suddenly to have magnified her stature and enhanced her beauty. Her book lay on the tumbled wraps at her feet, and in either hand she grasped a swivel shot. Hamilton's combative disposition came to the aid of his baser passion when he saw once more a defiant flash from his prisoner's face. It was easy for him to be fascinated by opposition. Helm had profited by this trait as much as others had suffered by it. But in the case of Alice, Hamilton's mingled resentment and admiration were but a powerful irritant to the coarsest and most dangerous side of his nature. After some fumbling and delay he fitted the key with a steady hand, and moved the wooden bolt creaking and jolting from its slot. Then flinging the clumsy door wide open, he stepped in. Alice started when she recognized the midnight intruder, and a second deeper look into his countenance made her brave heart recoil, while with a sinking sensation her breath almost stopped. It was but a momentary weakness, however, followed by vigorous action. "What are you here for, sir?" she demanded. "What do you want?" "I am neither a burglar nor a murderer, mademoiselle," he responded, lifting his hat and bowing, with a smile not in the least reassuring. "You look like both. Stop where you are." "Not so loud, my dear Miss Roussillon. I am not deaf. And besides, the garrison needs to sleep." "Stop, sir. Not another step." She poised herself, leaning slightly backward, and held the iron ball in her right hand, ready to throw it at him. He halted, still smiling villainously. "Mademoiselle, I assure you that your excitement is quite unnecessary. I am not here to harm you." "You cannot harm me, you cowardly wretch." "Humph! Pride goes before a fall, wench," he retorted, taking a half step backward. Then a thought arose in his mind which added a new shade to the repellent darkness of his countenance. "Miss Roussillon," he said in English, and with a changed voice, which seemed to grow harder, each word deliberately emphasized, "I have come to break some bad news to you." "You would scarcely bring me good news, sir, and I am not curious to hear the bad." He was silent for a little while, gazing at her with the sort of admiration from which a true woman draws away appalled. He saw how she loathed him, saw how impossible it was for him to get a line nearer to her by any turn of force or fortune. Brave, high-headed, strong as a young leopard, pure and sweet as a rose, she stood before him fearless, even aggressive, showing him by every line of her face and form that she felt her infinite superiority and meant to maintain it. Her whole personal expression told him he was defeated. Therefore he quickly seized upon a suggestion caught from a transaction with Longhair, who had returned a few hours before from his pursuit of Beverley. "It pains me, I assure you, Miss Roussillon, to tell you what will probably grieve you deeply," he presently added, "but I have not been unaware of your tender interest in Lieutenant Beverley, and when I had bad news from him I thought it my duty to inform you." He paused, feeling with a devil's satisfaction the point of his statement go home to the girl's heart. The wind was beginning to blow outside, shaking open the dark clouds and letting gleams of moonlight flicker on the thinning fog. A ghostly ray came through a crack between the logs and lit Alice's face with a pathetic wanness. She moved her lips as if speaking, but Hamilton heard no sound. "The Indian Longhair, whom I sent upon Lieutenant Beverley's trail, reported to me this afternoon that his pursuit had been quite successful. He caught his game." Alice's voice came to her now. She drew in a quivering breath of relief. "Then he is here. He is— You have him a prisoner again?" "A part of him, Miss Roussillon. Enough to be quite sure that there is one traitor who will trouble his king no more. Mr. Longhair brought in the lieutenant's scalp." Alice received this horrible statement in silence, but her face blanched, and she stood as if frozen by the shock. The shifty moon glimmer and the yellow glow of the lamp showed Hamilton to what an extent his devilish cruelty hurt her, and somehow it chilled him as if by reflection. But he could not forego another thrust. "He deserved hanging, and would have got it had he been brought to me alive. So, after all, you should be satisfied. He escaped my vengeance, and Longhair got his pay. You see, I am the chief sufferer." These words, however, fell without effect upon the girl's ears, in which was booming the awful storm-like roar of her excitement. She did not see her persecutor standing there. Her vision, unhindered by walls and distance, went straight away to a place in the wilderness, where all mangled and disfigured Beverley lay dead. A low cry broke from her lips. She dropped the heavy swivel balls, and then, like a bird, swiftly with a rustling swoop, she went past Hamilton and down the stair. For perhaps a full minute the man stood there motionless, stupefied, amazed, and when at length he recovered himself it was with difficulty that he followed her. Everything seemed to hinder him. When he reached the open air, however, he quickly regained his activity of both mind and body and looked in all directions. The clouds were breaking into parallel masses, with streaks of sky between. The moon, hanging aslant against the blue, peeped forth just in time to show him a flying figure which, even while he looked, reached the postern, opened it, and slipped through. With but a breath of hesitation between giving the alarm and following Alice silently and alone, he chose the latter. He was a swift runner and light-footed. With a few bounds he reached the little gate, which was still oscillating on its hinges, darted through and away, straining every muscle in desperate pursuit, gaining rapidly in the race, which bore eastward along the course twice before chosen by Alice in leaving the stockade. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice THOMPSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 17. A March Through Cold Water. On the 5th day of February, 1779, Colonel George Rogers Clarke led an army across the Kaskaskia River and camped. This was the first step in his march towards the Wabash. An army! Do not smile. Fewer than 200 men, it is true, answered the roll call, when Father Gibault lifted the cross and blessed them. But every name told off by the company sergeants belonged to a hero, and every voice making response struck a full note in the chorus of Freedom's morning song. It was an army, small indeed, but yet an army, even though so rudely equipped that, could we now see it before us, we might wonder of what use it could possibly be in a military way. We should nevertheless hardly expect that 170 of our best men, even if furnished with the latest and most deadly engines of destruction, could do what those pioneers cheerfully undertook and gloriously accomplished in the savage wilderness, which was to be the great central area of the United States of America. We look back with a shiver of awe at the 300 Spartans for whom Simonides composed his matchless epitaph. They wrought and died gloriously. That was Greek. The 170 men who, led by the backwoodsman Clarke, made conquest of an empire's area for freedom in the West, wrought and lived gloriously. That was American. It is well to bear in mind this distinction by which our civilization separates itself from that of old times. Our heroism has always been of life. Our heroes have conquered and lived to see the effect of conquest. We have fought all sorts of wars and have never yet felt defeat. Washington, Jackson, Taylor, Grant, all lived to enjoy, after successful war, a triumphant peace.
"These Americans," said a witty Frenchman, "are either enormously lucky or possessed of miraculous vitality. You rarely kill them in battle, and if you wound them their wounds are never mortal. Their history is but a chain of impossibilities easily accomplished. Their undertakings have been without preparation, their success is in the nature of stupendous accidents."
Such a statement may appear critically sound from a Gallic point of view, but it leaves out the dominant element of American character, namely, heroic efficiency. From the first we have had the courage to undertake, the practical common sense which overcomes the lack of technical training, and the vital force which never flags under the stress of adversity. Clarke knew when he set out on his march to Vincennes that he was not indulging a visionary impulse. The enterprise was one that called for all that manhood could endure, but not more. With the genius of a born leader he measured his task by his means. He knew his own courage and fortitude, and understood the best capacity of his men. He had genius. That is, he possessed the secret of extracting from himself and from his followers the last refinement of devotion to purpose. There was a certainty from first to last that effort would not flag at any point short of the topmost possible strain. The great star of America was no more than a nebulous splendor on the horizon in 1779. It was a new world forming by the law of youth. The men who bore the burdens of its exacting life were mostly stalwart striplings, who before the down of adolescence fairly sprouted on their chins, could swing the axe, drive a plow, close with a bear, or kill an Indian. Clarke was not yet 27 when he made his famous campaign. A tall, brawny youth, whose frontier experience had enriched a native character of the best quality, he marched on foot at the head of his little column, and was first to test every opposing danger. Was there a stream to wade or swim? Clarke enthusiastically shouted, "Come on!" and in he plunged. Was there a lack of food? "I'm not hungry," he cried. "Help yourselves, men." Had some poor soldier lost his blanket? "Mine is in my way," said Clarke. "Take it, I'm glad to get rid of it." His men loved him, and would rather die than fall short of his expectations. The march before them lay over a magnificent plain, mostly prairie, rich as the delta of the Nile, but extremely difficult to traverse. The distance, as the route led, was about 170 miles. On account of an open and rainy winter all the basins and flat lands were inundated, often presenting leagues of water ranging in depth from a few inches to 3 or 4 feet. Cold winds blew, sometimes with spits of snow and dashes of sleet, while thin ice formed on the ponds in sluggish streams. By day progress meant wading ankle deep, knee deep, breast deep, with an occasional spurt of swimming. By night the brave fellows had to sleep, if sleep they could, on the cold ground and soaked clothing under water-heavy blankets. They flung the leagues behind them, however, cheerfully stimulating one another by joke and challenge, defying all the bitterness of weather, all the bitings of hunger, all the toil, danger, and deprivation of a trackless and houseless wilderness, looking only eastward, following their youthful and intrepid commander to one of the most valuable victories gained by American soldiers during the War of the Revolution. Colonel Clarke understood perfectly the strategic importance of Vincennes as a post commanding the Wabash, and as a base of communication with the many Indian tribes north of the Ohio and east of the Mississippi. Francis Bigot, may his name never fade, had brought him a comprehensive and accurate report of Hamilton's strength and the condition of the fort and garrison. This information confirmed his belief that it would be possible not only to capture Vincennes, but Detroit as well. Just 7 days after the march began, the little army encamped for a night's rest at the edge of a wood. And here, just after nightfall, when the fires were burning merrily and the smell of broiling buffalo steaks burdened the damp air, a wizened old man suddenly appeared. How, or from where, nobody had observed. He was dirty, and in every way disreputable in appearance, looking like an animated mummy, bearing a long rifle on his shoulder, and walking with the somewhat halting activity of a very old, yet vivacious and energetic simian. Of course it was Oncle Jason, sui generis, as Father Beret had dubbed him. "Well, here I am," he cried, approaching the fire by which Colonel Clarke and some of his officers were cooking supper. "But ye can't guess in a mile o' who I am, to save your liver and lights." He danced a few stiff steps, which made the water gush out of his tattered moccasins, then doffed his nondescript cap, and nodded his scalpless head in salutation to the commander. Clarke looked inquiringly at him, while the old fellow grimaced and rubbed his shrunken chin.
I smelt your fat a-fryin' somethin' like a mile away, and it set my innards to grumblin' for a snack. So I just thought I'd drap in on ye and share wittles wi' ye." "Your looks are decidedly against you," remarked the colonel, with a dry smile. He had recognized Oncle Jason after a little sharp scrutiny. "I suppose, however, that we can let you gnaw the bones after we've got off the meat." Thank ye, plenty good. A feller that's as hungry as I am can go through a bone like a fish through water."
Clarke laughed and said, "I don't see any teeth that you have worth mentioning, but your gums may be unusually sharp."
"Yes, 'bout as sharp as your wit, Colonel Clarke, and sharper'n your eyes a long shot. Ye don't know me, do ye? Take another squint at me, and see if ye can remember a good-looking man."
"You have somewhat the appearance of an old scamp by the name of Jason that formerly loafed around with a worthless gun on his shoulder, and used to run from every Indian he saw down yonder in Kentucky." Clarke held out his hand, and added cordially, "How are you, Jason, my old friend, and where upon earth have you come from?" Oncle Jason pounced upon the hand and gripped it in his own knotted fingers, gazing delightedly up into Clarke's bronzed and laughing face.
"Where'd I come from? I come from everywheres. First time I ever got lost in all my born days. I've been a-trampin' round in the water seems like a week, crazy as a pizened rat, not a-knowin' north from south, near my big toe for a turnip. Who's got some tobaccer?"
Oncle Jason's story, when presently he told it, interested Clarke deeply. In the first place, he was glad to hear that Simon Kenton had once more escaped from the Indians; and the news from Beverly, although bad enough, left room for hope. Frontiersmen always regarded the chances better than even, so long as there was life. Oncle Jason, furthermore, had much to tell about the situation at Vincennes, the true feeling of the French inhabitants, the lukewarm friendship of the larger part of the Indians for Hamilton, and, indeed, everything that Clarke wished to know regarding the possibilities of success in his arduous undertaking. The old man's advent cheered the whole camp. He soon found acquaintances and friends among the French volunteers from Kaskaskia, with whom he exchanged Creole gestures and chatter with a vivacity apparently inexhaustible. He and Kenton had, with wise judgment, separated on escaping from the Indian camp, Kenton striking out for Kentucky, while Oncle Jason went towards Kaskaskia. The information that Beverly would be shot as soon as he was returned to Hamilton caused Colonel Clarke serious worry of mind. Not only the fact that Beverly, who had been a charming friend and a most gallant officer, was now in such imminent danger, but the impression, given by Oncle Jason's account, that he had broken his parole, was deeply painful to the brave and scrupulously honorable commander. Still, friendship rose above regret, and Clarke resolved to push his little column forward all the more rapidly, hoping to arrive in time to prevent the impending execution. Next morning the march was resumed at the break of dawn; but a swollen stream caused some hours of delay, during which Beverly himself arrived from the rear, a haggard and weirdly unkempt apparition. He had been for 3 days following hard on the army's track, which he came to far westward. Oncle Jason saw him first in the distance, and his old but educated eyes made no mistake.
"Yonder's that youngster Beverly," he exclaimed. "If it ain't I'm a squaw."
Nor did he parley further on the subject, but set off at a rickety trot to meet and assist the fagged and excited young man. Clarke had given Oncle Jason his flask, which contained a few gills of whiskey. This was the first thing offered to Beverly, who wisely took but a swallow. Oncle Jason was so elated that he waved his cap on high, and unconsciously falling into French, yelled in a piercing voice,
"Vive Georges Washington! Vive la bannière d'Alice Roussillon!"
Seeing Beverly reminded him of Alice and the flag. As for Beverly, the sentiment braced him, and the beloved name brimmed his heart with sweetness. Clarke went to meet them as they came in. He hugged the gaunt lieutenant with genuine fervor of joy, while Oncle Jason ran around them making a series of grotesque capers. The whole command, hearing Oncle Jason's patriotic words, set up a wild shouting on the spur of a general impression that Beverly came as a messenger bearing glorious news from Washington's army in the East. It was a great relief to Clarke when he found out that his favorite lieutenant had not broken his parole, but had instead boldly resurrendered himself, declaring the obligation no longer binding, and notifying Hamilton of his intention to go away with the purpose of returning and destroying him and his command. Clarke laughed heartily when his explanation brought out Beverley's tender interest in Alice, but he sympathized cordially, for he himself knew what love is. Although Beverley was half-starved and still suffering from the kicks and blows given him by Longhair and his warriors, his exhausting run on the trail of Clarke and his band had not worked him serious harm. All of the officers and men did their utmost to serve him. He was feasted without stint and furnished with everything that the scant supply of clothing on the pack horses could afford for his comfort. He promptly asked for an assignment to duty in his company, and took his place with such high enthusiasm that his companions regarded him with admiring wonder. None of them save Clarke and Oncle Jason suspected that love for a fair-haired girl yonder in Vincennes was the secret of his amazing zeal and intrepidity. In one respect Clarke's expedition was sadly lacking in its equipment for the march. It had absolutely no means of transporting adequate supplies. The pack horses were not able to carry more than a little extra ammunition, a few articles of clothing, some simple cooking utensils, and such tools as were needed in improvising rafts and canoes. Consequently, although buffalo and deer were sometimes plentiful, they furnished no lasting supply of meat, because it could not be transported; and as the army neared Vincennes, wild animals became scarce, so that the men began to suffer from hunger when within but a few days of their journey's end. Clarke made almost superhuman efforts in urging forward his chilled, water-soaked, foot-sore command; and when hunger added its torture to the already disheartening conditions, his courage and energy seemed to burn stronger and brighter. Beverley was always at his side, ready to undertake any task, accept any risk. His ardor made his face glow, and he seemed to thrive upon hardships. The two men were a source of inspiration. Their followers could not flag and hesitate while under the influence of their example. Toward the end of the long march, a decided fall of temperature added ice to the water through which our dauntless patriots waded and swam for miles. The wind shifted northwesterly, taking on a searching chill. Each gust, indeed, seemed to shoot wintry splinters into the very marrow of the men's bones. The weaker ones began to show the approach of utter exhaustion, just at the time when a final spurt of unflinching power was needed. True, they struggled heroically, but nature was nearing the inexorable limit of endurance. Without food, which there was no prospect of getting, collapse was sure to come. Standing nearly waist-deep in freezing water, and looking out upon the muddy, sea-like flood that stretched far away to the channel of the Wabash and beyond, Clarke turned to Beverley and said, speaking low, so as not to be overheard by any other of his officers or men, "Is it possible, Lieutenant Beverley, that we are to fail, with Vincennes almost in sight of us?" "No, sir, it is not possible," was the firm reply. "Nothing must, nothing can stop us. Look at that brave child. He sets the heroic example." Beverley pointed as he spoke at a boy but 14 years old, who was using his drum as a float to bear him up while he courageously swam beside the men. Clarke's clouded face cleared once more. "You are right," he said. "Come on. We must win or die. Sergeant DeWitt," he added, turning to an enormously tall and athletic man near by, "take that little drummer and his drum on your shoulder, and lead the way. And, Sergeant, make him pound that drum like the devil beating tanbark." The huge man caught the spirit of his commander's order. In a twinkling he had the boy astride of his neck, with the kettle drum resting on his head, and the rattling music began. Clarke followed, pointing onward with his sword. The half-frozen and tottering soldiers sent up a shout that went back to where Captain Bowman was bringing up the rear, under orders to shoot every man that straggled or shrank from duty. Now came a time when not a mouthful of food was left. A whole day they floundered on, starving, growing fainter at every step, the temperature falling, the ice thickening. They camped on high land, and next morning they heard Hamilton's distant sunrise gun boom over the water. "One half ration for the men," said Clarke, looking disconsolately in the direction whence the sound had come. "Just 5 mouthfuls apiece even, and I'll have Hamilton and his fort within 48 hours." "We will have the provisions, Colonel, or I will die trying to get them," Beverley responded. "Depend upon me." They had constructed some canoes in which to transport the weakest of the men. "I will take a dug-out and some picked fellows. We will pull to the wood yonder, and there we shall find some kind of game which has been forced to shelter from the high water." It was a cheerful view of a forlorn hope. Clarke grasped the hand extended by Beverley, and they looked encouragement into each other's eyes. Oncle Jason volunteered to go in the pirogue. He was ready for anything, everything.
"I can't shoot worth a cent," he whined as they took their places in the cranky pirogue, "but I might just happen to kill a squirrel, or an elephant, or something another."
"Very well," shouted Clarke in a loud, cheerful voice when they had paddled away to a considerable distance. "Bring the meat to the woods on the hill yonder," pointing to a distant island-like ridge far beyond the creeping flood. "We'll be there ready to eat it." He said this for the ears of his men. They heard and answered with a straggling but determined chorus of approval. They crossed the rolling current of the Wabash by a tedious process of ferrying, and at last found themselves once more wading in backwater up to their armpits, breaking ice an inch thick as they went. It was the closing struggle to reach the high wooded lands. Many of them fell exhausted, but their stronger comrades lifted them, holding their heads above water, and dragged them on. Clarke, always leading, always inspiring, was first to set foot on dry land. He shouted triumphantly, waved his sword, and then fell to helping the men out of the freezing flood. This accomplished, he ordered fires built; but there was not a soldier of them all whose hands could clasp an axe handle, so weak and numbed with cold were they. He was not to be baffled, however. If fire could not be had, exercise must serve its purpose. Hastily pouring some powder into his hand, he dampened it and blackened his face. "Victory, men, victory!" he shouted, taking off his hat and beginning to leap and dance. "Come on, we'll have a war dance, and then a feast, as soon as the meat arrives that I have sent for. Dance, you brave lads, dance! Victory! Victory!" The strong men, understanding their colonel's purpose, took hold of the delicate ones; and the leaping, the capering, the tumult of voices, and the stamping of slushy moccasins with which they assaulted that stately forest must have frightened every wild thing thereabout into a deadly rigour. Clarke's irrepressible energy and optimism worked a veritable charm upon his faithful but almost dying companions in arms. Their trust in him made them feel sure that food would soon be forthcoming. The thought afforded a stimulus more potent than wine. It drove them into an ecstasy of frantic motion and shouting which soon warmed them thoroughly. It is said that fortune favours the brave. The larger meaning of the sentence may be given thus: God guards those who deserve his protection. History tells us that just when Clarke halted his command almost in sight of Vincennes, just when hunger was about to prevent the victory so close to his grasp, a party of his scouts brought in the haunch of a buffalo captured from some Indians. The scouts were Lieutenant Beverley and Oncle Jason; and with the meat they brought Indian kettles in which to cook it. With consummate forethought, Clarke arranged to prevent his men doing themselves injury by bolting their food or eating it half cooked. Broth was first made and served hot; then small bits of well broiled steak were doled out, until by degrees the fine effect of nourishment set in, and all the command felt the fresh courage of healthy reaction.
"I ain't no general, nor corporal, nor nothin'," remarked Oncle Jason to Colonel Clarke; "but if I's you, I'd hist up every dinged old flag in the regiment, when I got ready to show myself to 'em, and I'd make 'em think over yonder at the fort, 'at I had about 90,000 men. It'd scare that sandy-faced governor over there, till he'd think his backbone was a-comin' out in him by the roots."
Clarke laughed, but his face showed that the old man's suggestion struck him forcibly and seriously. "We'll see about that presently, Oncle Jason. Wait till we reach the hill yonder, from which the whole town can observe our manoeuvres, then we'll try it, maybe." Once more the men were lined up, the roll call gone through with satisfactorily, and the question put: "Are we ready for another plunge through the mud and water?" The answer came in the affirmative, with a unanimity not to be mistaken. The weakest heart of them all beat to the time of the charge step. Again Clarke and Beverley clasped hands and took the lead. When they reached the next high ground they gazed in silence across a slushy prairie plot to where, on a slight elevation, old Vincennes and Fort Sackville lay in full view. Beverley stood apart. A rush of sensations affected him so that he shook like one whose strength is gone. His vision was blurred. Fort and town, swimming in a mist, were silent and still. Save the British flag twinkling above Hamilton's headquarters, nothing indicated that the place was not deserted. And Alice? With the sweet name's echo Beverley's heart bounded high, then sank fluttering at the recollection that she was either yonder at the mercy of Hamilton, or already the victim of an unspeakable cruelty. Was it weakness for him to lift his clasped hands heavenward and send up a voiceless prayer? While he stood thus, Oncle Jason came softly to his side and touched his arm. Beverley started.
"The next thing'll be to shoot the everlasting gizzards out on 'em, won't it?" the old man inquired. "I'm just a-itchin' to get a grip onto that governor. If I don't scalp him, I'm a squaw."
Beverley drew a deep breath and came promptly back from his dream. It was now Oncle Jason's turn to assume a reflective, reminiscent mood. He looked about him with an expression of vague half-tenderness on his shriveled features.
"I's jest a-thinkin' how time do run past a feller," he presently remarked. 27 years ago I camped right here with my wife, 9th one, if I 'member correct. Just fresh married to her. Sort o' honeymoon. 'Twas warm and sunshiny nice. She was a purty squaw, mighty purty, and I was as happy as a tomtit on a sugar trough. We biled sap yonder on them knobs under the maples. It was glorious. Had some several wives for and lots of 'em since, but she was sweetest of 'em all. Strange how a feller 'members sich things and feels sort o' lonesome like."
The old man's mouth drooped at the corners, and he hitched up his buckskin trousers with a ludicrous suggestion of pathos in every line of his attitude. Unconsciously he sidled closer to Beverley, remotely feeling that he was giving the young man very effective sympathy, well knowing that Alice was the sweet burden of his thoughts. It was thus Oncle Jason honestly tried to fortify his friend against what probably lay in store for him. But Beverley failed to catch the old man's crude comfort thus flung at him. The analogy was not apparent. Oncle Jason probably felt that his kindness had been ineffectual, for he changed his tone, and added,
"But I s'pose a young feller like ye can't understand what it is to love a woman and have her quit ye for another feller and him a buck Injun. Wall, that's the way it do go. Of all the livin' things upon top of this yere globe, the most unsartain, crinkety, and slippery thing is a young woman that knows she's a purty, and that every other man in the known world is blind, stavin' crazy in love wi' her, same as you are. She'll drop ye like a hot tatter 'fore you know it, and then look at ye just pine blank like she never knowed ye afore in her life. It's so, Lieutenant, sure's you're born. I know, for I've tried the odd number of 'em, and they're all just the same."
By this time Beverley's ears were deaf to Oncle Jason's querulous, whining voice, and his thoughts once more followed his wistful gaze across the watery plain to where the low roofs of the Creole town appeared dimly wavering in the twilight of eventide, which was fast fading into night. The scene seemed unsubstantial. He felt a strange lethargy possessing his soul. He could not realize the situation. In trying to imagine Alice, she eluded him, so that a sort of cloudy void fell across his vision with the effect of baffling and benumbing it. He made vain efforts to recall her voice, things that she had said to him, her face, her smiles. All he could do was to evoke an elusive, tantalizing, ghostly something which made him shiver inwardly with a haunting fear that it meant the worst, whatever the worst might be. Where was she? Could she be dead, and this the shadowy message of her fate? Darkness fell, and a thin fog began to drift in wan streaks above the water. Not a sound, save the suppressed stir of the camp, broke the wide, dreary silence. Oncle Jason babbled until satisfied that Beverley was unappreciative, or at least unresponsive.
"Got to have some terbacker,"
he remarked, and shambled away in search of it among his friends. A little later Clarke approached hastily and said, "I have been looking for you. The march has begun. Bowman and Charleville are moving. Come, there's no time to lose." End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice THOMPSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 18. A Duel by Moonlight. When Hamilton, after running some distance, saw that he was gaining upon Alice and would soon overtake her, it added fresh energy to his limbs. He had quickly realized the foolishness of what he had done in visiting the room of his prisoner at so late an hour in the night. What would his officers and men think? To let Alice escape would be extremely embarrassing, and to be seen chasing her would give good ground for ridicule on the part of his entire command. Therefore his first thought, after passing through the postern and realizing fully what sort of predicament threatened him, was to recapture her and return her to the prison room in the blockhouse without attracting attention. This now promised to be an easier task than he had at first feared, for in the moonlight, which on account of the dispersing clouds was fast growing stronger, he saw her seem to falter and weaken. Certainly her flight was checked, and took an eccentric turn, as if some obstruction had barred her way. He rushed on, not seeing that, as Alice swerved, a man intervened. Indeed, he was within a few strides of laying his hand on her when he saw her make the strange movement. It was as if, springing suddenly aside, she had become two persons instead of one. But instantly the figures coincided again, and in becoming taller faced about and confronted him. Hamilton stopped short in his tracks. The dark figure was about 5 paces from him. It was not Alice, and his sword flashed dimly but unmistakably in a ray of the moon. The motion visible was that of an expert swordsman placing himself firmly on his legs with his weapon at guard. Alice saw the man in her path just in time to avoid running against him. Lightly as a flying bird when it whisks itself in a short semicircle past a tree or a bough, she sprang aside and swung around to the rear of him, where she could continue her course toward the town. But in passing she recognized him. It was Father Beret, and how grim he looked! The discovery was made in the twinkling of an eye, and its effect was instantaneous, not only checking the force of her flight, but stopping her and turning her about to gaze before she had gone 5 paces farther. Hamilton's nerve held, startled as he was, when he realized that an armed man stood before him. Naturally he fell into the error of thinking that he had been running after this fellow all the way from the little gate where he supposed Alice had somehow given him the slip. It was a mere flash of brainlight, so to call it, struck out by the surprise of this curious discovery. He felt his bellicose temper leap up furiously at being balked in a way so unexpected and withal so inexplicable. Of course he did not stand there reasoning it all out. The rush of impressions came, and at the same time he acted with promptness. Changing the rapier, which he held in his right hand, over into his left, he drew a small pistol from the breast of his coat and fired. The report was sharp and loud, but it caused no uneasiness or inquiry in the fort, owing to the fact that Indians invariably emptied their guns when coming into the town. Hamilton's aim, although hasty, was not bad. The bullet from his weapon cut through Father Beret's clothes between his left arm and his body, slightly creasing the flesh on a rib. Beyond him it struck heavily and audibly. Alice fell limp and motionless to the soft wet ground, where cold puddles of water were splintered over with ice. She lay pitifully crumpled, one arm outstretched in the moonlight. Father Beret heard the bullet hit her, and turned in time to see her stagger backward with a hand convulsively pressed over her heart. Her face, slightly upturned as she reeled, gave the moon a pallid target for its strengthening rays. Sweet, beautiful, its rigid features flashed for a second, and then half turned away from the light and went down. Father Beret uttered a short, thin cry, and moved as if to go to the fallen girl, but just then he saw Hamilton's sword pass over again into his right hand, and knew that there was no time for anything but death or fight. The good priest did not shirk what might have made the readiest of soldiers nervous. Hamilton was known to be a great swordsman, and proud of the distinction. Father Beret had seen him fence with Farnsworth in remarkable form, touching him at will, and in ministering to the men in the fort he had heard them talk of the governor's incomparable skill. A priest is, in perhaps all cases, but the last out of 1,000 a man of peace, not to be forced into a fight; but the exceptional one out of the 100 it is well not to stir up if you are looking for an easy victim. Hamilton was in the habit of considering every antagonist immediately conquerable. His domineering spirit could not, when opposed, reckon with any possibility of disaster. As he sprang toward Father Beret there was a mutual recognition, and, we speak guardedly, something that sounded exactly like an exchange of furious execrations. As for Father Beret's words, they may have been a mere priestly formula of objurgation. The moon was accommodating. With a beautiful white splendor it entered a space of cloudless sky, where it seemed to slip along the dusky blue surface among the stars far over in the west. "It's you, is it?" Hamilton exclaimed between teeth that almost crushed one another. "You prowling hypocrite of hell!" Father Beret said something. It was not complimentary, and it sounded sulphurous, if not profane. Remember, however, that a priest can scarcely hope to be better than Peter, and Peter did actually make the simon pure remark when hard pressed. At all events, Father Beret said something with vigorous emphasis, and met Hamilton halfway. Both men, stimulated to the finger-tips by a draught of imperious passion, fairly plunged to the inevitable conflict. Ah, if Alice could have seen her beautiful weapons cross, if she could have heard the fine, far-reaching clink, 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 while sparks leaped forth dazzling even in the moonlight; if she could have noted the admirable, nay, the amazing play as the men, regaining coolness to some extent, gathered their forces and fell cautiously to the deadly work, it would have been enough to change the cold shimmer of her face to a flash of warm delight. For she would have understood every feint, lunge, parry, and seen at a glance how Father Beret set the pace and led the race at the beginning. She would have understood, for Father Beret had taught her all she knew about the art of fencing. Hamilton quickly felt, and with a sense of its strangeness, the priest's masterly command of his weapon. The surprise called up all his caution and cleverness. Before he could adjust himself to such an unexpected condition he came near being spitted outright by a pretty pass under his guard. The narrow escape, while it put him on his best mettle, sent a wave of superstition through his brain. He recalled what Barlow had jocularly said about the doings of the devil priest, or priest devil, at Roussillon Place on that night when the patrol guard attempted to take Gaspard Roussillon. Was this, indeed, Father Beret, that gentle old man, now before him, or was it an avenging demon from the shades? The thought flitted electrically across his mind while he deftly parried, feinted, lunged, giving his dark antagonist all he could do to meet the play. Priest or devil, he thought, he cared not which, he would reach its vitals presently. Yet there lingered with him a haunting half-fear or tenuous awe, which may have aided rather than hindered his excellent swordsmanship. Underfoot it was slushy with mud, water, and ice, the consistency varying from a somewhat solid crust to puddles that half inundated Hamilton's boots and quite overflowed Father Beret's moccasins. An execrable field for the little matter in hand. They gradually shifted position. Now it was the governor, then the priest, who had advantage as to the light. For some time Father Beret seemed quite the shiftier and surer fighter, but, was it his age telling on him, he lost perceptibly in suppleness. Still Hamilton failed to touch him. There was a baffling something in the old man's escape now and again from what ought to have been an inevitable stroke. Was it luck? It seemed to Hamilton more than that, a sort of uncanny evasion. Or was it supreme mastery, the last and subtlest reach of the fencer's craft? Youth forced age slowly backward in the struggle, which at times took on spurts so furious that the slender blades, becoming mere glints of acicular steel, split the moonlight back and forth, up and down, so that their meetings, following one another in a well-nigh continuous stroke, sent a jarring noise through the air. Father Beret lost inch by inch until the fighting was almost over the body of Alice. And now, for the first time, Hamilton became aware of that motionless something with the white, luminous face in profile against the ground. But he did not let even that unsettle his fencing gaze, which followed the sunken and dusky eyes of his adversary. A perspiration suddenly flooded his body, however, and began to drip across his face. His arm was tiring. A doubt crept like a chill into his heart. Then the priest appeared to add a cubit to his stature and waver strangely in the soft light. Behind him, low against the sky, a wide-winged owl shot noiselessly across just above the prairie. The soul of a true priest is double. It is the soul of a saint and the soul of a worldly man. What is most beautiful in this duality is the supreme courage with which the saintly spirit attacks the worldly and so often heroically masters it. In the beginning of the fight Father Beret let a passion of the earthly body take him by storm. It was well for Governor Henry Hamilton that the priest was so wrought upon as to unsettle his nerves, otherwise there would have been an evil heart impaled midway of Father Beret's rapier. A little later the saintly spirit began to assert itself, feebly indeed, but surely. Then it was that Father Beret seemed to be losing agility for a while as he backstepped away from Hamilton's increasing energy of assault. In his heart the priest was saying, "I will not murder him. I must not do that. He deserves death, but vengeance is not mine. I will disarm him." Step by step he retreated, playing erratically to make an opening for a trick he meant to use. It was singularly loose play, a sort of wavering, shifty, incomprehensible show of carelessness, that caused Hamilton to entertain a doubt which was really a fear as to what was going to happen; for notwithstanding all this neglect of due precaution on the priest's part, to touch him seemed impossible, miraculously so, and every plan of attack dissolved into futility in the most maddening way. "Priest, devil, or ghost," raged Hamilton, with a froth gathering around his mouth, "I'll kill you, or—" He made a lunge, when his adversary left an opening which appeared absolutely beyond defence. It was a quick, dexterous, vicious thrust. The blade leaped toward Father Beret's heart with a twinkle like lightning. At that moment, although warily alert and hopeful that his opportunity was at hand, Father Beret came near losing his life, for as he sidestepped and easily parried Hamilton's thrust, which he had invited, thinking to entangle his blade and disarm him, he caught his foot in Alice's skirt and stumbled, nearly falling across her. It would have been easy for Hamilton to run him through had he instantly followed up the advantage. But the moonlight on Alice's face struck his eyes, and by that indirect ray of vision which is often strangely effective, he recognized her lying there. It was a disconcerting thing for him, but he rallied instantly and sprang aside, taking a new position just in time to face Father Beret again. A chill crept up his back. The horror which he could not shake off enraged him beyond measure. Gathering fresh energy, he renewed the assault with desperate steadiness, the highest product of absolutely molten fury. Father Beret felt the dangerous access of power in his antagonist's arm, and knew that a crisis had arrived. He could not be careless now. Here was a swordsman of the best school calling upon him for all the skill and strength and cunning that he could command. Again the saintly element was near being thrown aside by the worldly in the old man's breast. Alice, lying there, seemed mutely demanding that he avenge her. A riotous something in his blood clamored for a quick and certain act in this drama by moonlight, a tragic close by a stroke of terrible yet perfectly fitting justice. There was but the space of a breath for the conflict in the priest's heart, yet during that little time he reasoned the case and quoted Scripture to himself. "Domine percutimus in gladio," rang through his mind. "Lord, shall we smite with the sword?" Hamilton seemed to make answer to this with a dazzling display of skill. The rapier sang a strange song above the sleeping girl, a lullaby with coruscations of death in every keen note. Father Beret was thinking of Alice. His brain playing double, calculated with lightning swiftness the chances and movements of that whirlwind rush of fight, while at the same time it swept through a retrospect of all the years since Alice came into his life. How he had watched her grow and bloom, how he had taught her, trained her mind and soul and body to high things, loved her with a fatherly passion unbounded, guarded her from the coarse and lawless influences of her surroundings. Like the tolling of an infinitely melancholy bell, all this went through his breast and brain, and, blending with a furious current of whatever passions were deadly dangerous in his nature, swept as a storm bearing its awful force into his sword arm. The Englishman was a lion, the priest a gladiator. The stars aloft in the vague, dark, yet splendid amphitheatre were the audience. It was a question: would the thumbs go down or up? Life and death held the chances even, but it was at the will of heaven, not of the stars. Hoc habet must follow the stroke ordered from beyond the astral clusters and the dusky blue. Hamilton pressed, nay, rushed the fight with a weight and at a pace which could not last. But Father Beret withstood him so firmly that he made no farther headway. He even lost some ground a moment later. "You damned Jesuit hypocrite!" he snarled. "You lowest of a vile brotherhood of liars!" Then he rushed again, making a magnificent show of strength, quickness, and accuracy. The sparks hissed and crackled from beyond the rasping and ringing blades. Father Beret was in truth a Jesuit, and as such a zealot, but he was not a liar or a hypocrite. Being human, he resented an insult. The saintly spirit in him was strong, yet not strong enough to breast the indignation which now dashed against it. For a moment it went down. "Liar and scoundrel yourself!" he retorted hoarsely, forcing the words out of his throat. "Spawn of a beastly breed!" Hamilton saw and felt a change pass over the spirit of the old priest's movements. Instantly the sword leaping against his own seemed endowed with a subtle cunning and malignant treachery. Before this it had been difficult enough to meet the fine play and hold fairly even; now he was startled and confused; but he rose to the emergency with admirable will, power, and cleverness. "Murderer of a poor orphan girl!" Father Beret added with a hot concentrated accent. "Death is too good for you." Hamilton felt nearer his grave than ever before in all his wild experience, for somehow doom, shadowy and formless, like the atmosphere of an awful dream, enmisted those words. But he was no weakling to quit at the height of desperate conflict. He was strong, expert, and game to the middle of his heart. "I'll add a traitor Jesuit to my list of dead," he panted forth, rising yet again to the extremest tension of his power. As he did this, Father Beret settled himself, as you have seen a mighty horse do in the home stretch of a race. Both men knew that the moment had arrived for the final act in their impromptu play. It was short, a duel condensed and crowded into 15 seconds of time, and it was rapid beyond the power of words to describe. A bystander, had there been one, could not have seen what was finally done or how it was done. Father Beret's sword seemed to be revolving. It was a halo in front of Hamilton for a mere point of time. The old priest seemed to crouch and then make a quick motion as if about to leap backward. A wrench and a snip, as of something violently jerked from a fastening, were followed by a semicircular flight of Hamilton's rapier over Father Beret's head to stick in the ground 10 feet behind him. The duel was over, and the whole terrible struggle had occupied less than 3 minutes. With his wrists strained and his fingers almost broken, Hamilton stumbled forward and would have impaled himself had not Father Beret turned the point of his weapon aside as he lowered it. "Surrender, or die." That was a strange order for a priest to make, but there could be no mistaking its authority or the power behind it. Hamilton regained his footing and looked dazed, wheezing and puffing like a porpoise, but he clearly understood what was demanded of him. "If you call out, I'll run you through," Father Beret added, seeing him move his lips as if to shout for help. The level rapier now reinforced the words. Hamilton let the breath go noiselessly from his mouth, and waved his hand in token of enforced submission. "Well, what do you want me to do?" he demanded after a short pause. "You seem to have me at your mercy. What are your terms?" Father Beret hesitated. It was a question difficult to answer. "Give me your word as a British officer that you will never again try to harm any person, not an open armed enemy, in this town." Hamilton's gorge rose perversely. He erected himself with lofty reserve and folded his arms. The dignity of a lieutenant governor leaped into him and took control. Father Beret correctly interpreted what he saw. "My people have borne much," he said, "and the killing of that poor child there will be awfully avenged if I but say the word. Besides, I can turn every Indian in this wilderness against you in a single day. You are indeed at my mercy, and I will be merciful if you will satisfy my demand." He was trembling with emotion while he spoke, and the desire to kill the man before him was making a frightful struggle with his priestly conscience. But conscience had the upper hand. Hamilton stood gazing fixedly, pale as a ghost, his thoughts becoming more and more clear and logical. He was in a bad situation. Every word that Father Beret had spoken was true and went home with force. There was no time for parley or subterfuge. The sword looked as if, eager to find his heart, it could not be held back another moment. But the wan, cold face of the girl had more power than the rapier's hungry point. It made an abject coward of him. "I am willing to give you my word," he presently said. "And let me tell you," he went on more rapidly, "I did not shoot at her. She was behind you." "Your word as a British officer?" Hamilton again stiffened and hesitated, but only for the briefest space, then said, "Yes, my word as a British officer." Father Beret waved his hand with impatience. "Go, then, back to your place in the fort and disturb my people no more. The soul of this poor little girl will haunt you forever. Go." Hamilton stood a little while gazing at the face of Alice with the horrible wistfulness of remorse. What he would not have given to rub his eyes and find it all a dream. He turned away. A cloud scuttled across the moon. Here and yonder in the dim town cocks crowed with a lonesome desultory effect. Father Beret plucked up the rapier that he had wrenched from Hamilton's hand. It suggested something. "Hold!" he called out. "Give me the scabbard of this sword." Hamilton, who was striding vigorously in the direction of the fort, turned about as the priest hastened to him. "Give me the scabbard of this rapier. I want it. Take it off." The command was not gently voiced. A hoarse half-whisper winged every word with an imperious threat. Hamilton obeyed. His hands were not firm, his fingers fumbled nervously, but he hurried, and Father Beret soon had the rapier sheathed and secured at his belt beside its mate. A good and true priest is a burden-bearer. His motto is Alter alterius onera portate. Bear ye one another's burdens. His soul is enriched with the cast-off sorrows of those whom he relieves. Father Beret scarcely felt the weight of Alice's body when he lifted it from the ground, so heavy was the pressure of his grief. All that her death meant, not only to him, but to every person who knew her, came into his heart as the place of refuge consecrated for the indwelling of pain. He lifted her and bore her as far toward Roussillon Place as he could, but his strength fell short just in front of the little Boursier cottage, and half dead he staggered across the veranda to the door, where he sank exhausted. After a breathing spell he knocked. The household, fast asleep, did not hear, but he persisted until the door was opened to him and his burden. Captain Farnsworth unclosed his bloodshot eyes at about 8 o'clock in the morning, quite confused as to his place and surroundings. He looked about drowsily, with a sheepish half-knowledge of having been very drunk. A purring in his head and a dull ache reminded him of an abused stomach. He yawned and stretched himself, then sat up, running a hand through his tousled hair. Father Beret was on his knees before the cross, still as a statue, his clasped hands extended upward. Farnsworth's face lighted with recognition, and he smiled rather bitterly. He recalled everything and felt ashamed, humiliated, self-debased. He had outraged even a priest's hospitality with his brutish appetite, and he hated himself for it. Disgust nauseated his soul apace with the physical sinking and squirming that grew upon him. "I'm a shabby, worthless dog," he muttered with petulant accent. "Why don't you kick me out, Father?" The priest turned a collapsed and bloodless grey face upon him, smiled in a tired, perfunctory way, crossed himself absently, and said, "You have rested well, my son. Hard as the bed is, you have done it a compliment in the way of sleeping. You young soldiers understand how to get the most out of things." "You are too generous, Father, and I can't appreciate it. I know what I deserve, and you know it too. Tell me what a brute and fool I am. It will do me good. Punch me a solid jolt in the ribs like the one you gave me not long ago." "Qui sine peccato est, primus lapidem mittat," said the priest. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." He had gone to the hearth, and was taking from the embers an earthen saucer, or shallow bowl, in which some fragrant broth simmered and steamed. "A man who has slept as long as you have, my son, usually has a somewhat delicate appetite. Now here is a soup, not especially satisfying to the taste of a gourmet like yourself, but possessing the soothing quality that is good for one just aroused from an unusual nap. I offer it, my son, propter stomachum tuum et frequente tuas infirmitates. on account of thy stomach and thine often infirmities. The soup will go to the right spot." While speaking, he brought the hot bowl to Farnsworth and set it on the bed cover before him, then fetched a big horn spoon. The fragrance of pungent roots and herbs, blent with a savory waft of buffalo meat, greeted the captain's sense, and the anticipation itself cheered his aching throat. It made him feel greedy and in a hurry. The first spoonful, a trifle bitter, was not so pleasant at the beginning, but a moment after he swallowed it a hot prickling set in and seemed to dart through him from extremity to extremity. Slowly, as he ate, the taste grew more agreeable, and all the effects of his debauch disappeared. It was like magic. His blood warmed and glowed as if touched with mysterious fire. "What is in this soup, Father Beret, that makes it so searching and refreshing?" he demanded when the bowl was empty. Father Beret shook his head and smiled drolly. "That I cannot divulge, my son, owing to a promise I had to make to the aged Indian who gave me the secret. It is the elixir of the Miamis. Only their consecrated medicine men hold the recipe. The stimulation is but temporary." Just then someone knocked at the door. Father Beret opened it to one of Hamilton's aides. "Your pardon, father, but hearing Captain Farnsworth's voice I made bold to knock." "What is it, Bobby?" Farnsworth called out. "Nothing, only the governor has been having you looked for in every nook and corner of the fort and town. You'd better report at once, or he'll be having us drag the river for your body." "All right, Lieutenant. Go back and keep mum, that's a dear boy, and I'll shuffle into Colonel Hamilton's august presence before many minutes." The aide laughed and went his way whistling a merry tune. "Now I am sure to get what I deserve, with usury at 40% in advance," said Farnsworth dryly, shrugging his shoulders with undissembled dread of Hamilton's wrath. But the anticipation was not realized. The governor received Farnsworth stiffly enough, yet in a way that suggested a suppressed desire to avoid explanations on the captain's part and a reprimand on his own. In fact, Hamilton was hoping that something would turn up to shield him from the effect of his terrible midnight adventure, which seemed the darker the more he thought of it. He had a slow, numb conscience lying deep where it was hard to reach, and when a qualm somehow entered it he endured in secret what most men would have cast off or confessed. He was haunted, if not with remorse, at last by a dread of something most disagreeable in connection with what he had done. Alice's white face had impressed itself indelibly on his memory, so that it met his inner vision at every turn. He was afraid to converse with Farnsworth lest she should come up for discussion. Consequently their interview was curt and formal. It was soon discovered that Alice had escaped from the stockade, and some show of search was made for her by Hamilton's order, but Farnsworth looked to it that the order was not carried out. He thought he saw at once that his chief knew where she was. The mystery perplexed and pained the young man, and caused him to fear all sorts of evil. But there was a chance that Alice had found a safe retreat, and he knew that nothing but ill could befall her if she were discovered and brought back to the fort. Therefore his search for her became his own secret and for his own heart's ease. And doubtless he would have found her, for even handicapped and distorted love like his is lynx-eyed and sure on the track of its object. But a great event intervened and swept away his opportunity. Hamilton's uneasiness, which was that of a strong, misguided nature trying to justify itself amid a confusion of unmanageable doubts and misgivings, now vented itself in a resumption of the repairs he had been making at certain points in the fort. These he completed just in time for the coming of Clarke. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice THOMPSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 19. The Attack. It has already been mentioned that Indians, arriving singly or in squads to report at Hamilton's headquarters, were in the habit of firing their guns before entering the town or the fort, not only as a signal of their approach, but in order to rid their weapons of their charges preliminary to cleaning them before setting out upon another scalp-hunting expedition. A shot, therefore, or even a volley heard on the outskirts of the village was not a noticeable incident in the daily and nightly experience of the garrison. Still, for some reason, Governor Hamilton started violently when, just after nightfall, 5 or 6 rifles cracked sharply a short distance from the stockade. He and Helm, with 2 other officers, were in the midst of a game of cards, while a kettle, swinging on a crane in the ample fireplace, sang a shrill promise of hot applejack toddy. "By Jove!" exclaimed Farnsworth, who, although not in the game, was amusing himself with looking on. "You jump like a fine lady. I almost fancied I heard a bullet hit you." "You may all jump while you can," remarked Helm. "That's Clarke, and your time's short. He'll have this fort tumbling on your heads before daylight of to-morrow morning comes." As he spoke he arose from his seat at the card table and went to look after the toddy which, as an expert, he had under supervision. Hamilton frowned. The mention of Clarke was disturbing. Ever since the strange disappearance of Lieutenant Barlow he had nursed the fear that possibly Clarke's scouts had captured him, and that the American forces might be much nearer than Kaskaskia. Besides, his nerves were unruly, as they had been ever since the encounter with Father Beret, and his vision persisted in turning back upon the accusing cold face of Alice lying in the moonlight. One little detail of that scene almost maddened him at times. It was a sheeny, crinkled wisp of warm-looking hair looped across the cheek in which he had often seen a saucy dimple dance when Alice spoke or smiled. He was bad enough, but not wholly bad, and the thought of having darkened those merry eyes and stilled those sweet dimples tore through him with a cold, rasping pang. "Just as soon as this toddy is properly mixed and tempered," said Helm, with a magnetic jocosity beaming from his genial face, "I'm going to propose a toast to the banner of Alice Roussillon, which a whole garrison of British braves has been unable to take." "If you do, I'll blow a hole through you as big as the south door of hell," said Hamilton, in the voice fairly shaken to a husky quaver with rage. "You may do a great many insulting things, but not that." Helm was in a half-stooping attitude, with a ladle in one hand, a cup in the other. He had met Hamilton's glowering look with a peculiarly innocent smile, as if to say, "What in the world is the matter now? I never felt in a better humour in all my life. Can't you take a joke, I wonder?" He did not speak, however, for a rattling volley of musket and rifle shots hit the top of the clay-daubed chimney, sending down into the toddy a shower of soot and dirt. In a wink every man was on his feet and staring. "Gentlemen," said Helm with an impressive oath, "that is Clarke's soldiers, and they will take your fort, but they ought not to have spoiled this apple toddy." "Oh, the devil!" said Hamilton, forcibly resuming a calm countenance. "It is only a squad of drunken Indians coming in. We'll forego excitement. There's no battle on hand, gentlemen." "I'm glad you think so, Governor Hamilton," Helm responded. "But I should imagine that I ought to know the crack of a Kentucky rifle. I've heard one occasionally in my life. Besides, I got a whiff of freedom just now." "Captain Helm is right," observed Farnsworth. "That is an attack." Another volley, this time nearer and more concentrated, convinced Hamilton that he was indeed at the opening of a fight. Even while he was giving some hurried orders to his officers, a man was wounded at one of the portholes. Then came a series of yells, answered by a ripple of sympathetic French shouting that ran through the town. The patrol guards came straggling in, breathless with excitement. They swore to having seen 1,000 men marching across the water-covered meadows. Hamilton was brave. The approach of danger stirred him like a trumpet strain. His fighting blood rose to full tide, and he gave his orders with the steadiness and commanding force of a born soldier. The officers hastened to their respective positions. On all sides sounds indicative of rapid preparations for the fight mingled into a confused strain of military energy. Men marched to their places, cannon were wheeled into position, and soon enough the firing began in good earnest. Late in the afternoon a rumour of Clarke's approach had gone abroad through the village, but not a French lip breathed it to a friend of the British. The Creoles were loyal to the cause of freedom. Moreover, they cordially hated Hamilton, and their hearts beat high at the prospect of a change in masters at the fort. Every cabin had its hidden gun and supply of ammunition, despite the order to disarm issued by Hamilton. There was a hustling to bring these forth, which was accompanied with a guarded yet irrepressible chattering, delightfully French and infinitely volatile. "Tiens, je vais frotter mon fusil. J'ai vu un singe," said Jacques Boursier to his daughter, the pretty Adrienne, who was coming out of the room in which Alice lay. "I saw a monkey just now. I must rub up my gun." He could not be solemn, not he. The thought of an opportunity to get even with Hamilton was like wine in his blood. If you had seen those hardy and sinewy Frenchmen gliding in the dusk of evening from cottage to cottage, passing the word that the Americans had arrived, saying airy things and pinching one another as they met and hurried on, you would have thought something very amusing and wholly jocund was in preparation for the people of Vincennes. There was a current belief in the town that Gaspard Roussillon never missed a good thing and always somehow got the lion's share. He went out with the ebb to return on the flood. Nobody was surprised, therefore, when he suddenly appeared in the midst of his friends, armed to the teeth and emotionally warlike to suit the occasion. Of course he took charge of everybody and everything. You could have heard him whisper a bow shot away. "Taisons," he hissed, whenever he met an acquaintance. "We will surprise the fort and scalp the whole garrison. Aux armes! Les Américains viennent d'arriver." At his own house he knocked and called in vain. He shook the door violently, for he was thinking of the stores under the floor, of the grimy bottles, of the fragrant Bordeaux. Ah, his throat, how it throbbed! But where was Madame Roussillon? Where was Alice? "Jean! Jean!" he cried, forgetting all precaution. "Come here, you scamp, and let me in this minute." A profoundly impressive silence gave him to understand that his home was deserted. "Chief! Frightened and gone to stay with Madame Godert, I suppose. And I so thirsty. Bah, hum, hum! Après le vin, la bataille, zif!" He kicked in the door and groped his way to the liquors. While he hastily swigged and smacked, he heard the firing begin with a crackling desultory volley. He laughed jovially there in the dark, between draughts and deep sighs of enjoyment. "Et moi aussi," he murmured, like the vast murmur of the sea. "I want to be in that dance. Pardonnez, messieurs. Moi, je veux danser, s'il vous plaît." And when he had filled himself, he plunged out and rushed away, wrought up to the extreme fighting pitch of temper. Diable! If he could but come across that Lieutenant Barlow, how he would smash him and mangle him! In magnifying his prowess with the lens of imagination, he swelled and puffed as he lumbered along. The firing sounded as if it were between the fort and the river; but presently, when one of Hamilton's cannon spoke, Monsieur Roussillon saw the yellow spike of flame from its muzzle leap directly toward the church, and he thought it best to make a wide detour to avoid going between the firing lines. Once or twice he heard the whine of a stray bullet high overhead. Before he had gone very far he met a man hurrying toward the fort. It was Captain Francis Maisonville, one of Hamilton's chief scouts, who had been out on a reconnaissance and, cut off from his party by some of Clarke's forces, was trying to make his way to the main gate of the stockade. Monsieur Roussillon knew Maisonville as a somewhat desperate character, a leader of Indian forays and a trader in human scalps. Surely the fellow was a legitimate prey. "Zif, diable de gredin!" he snarled, and leaping upon him, choked him to the ground. "Je vais vous scalper immédiatement." Clarke's plan of approach showed masterly strategy. Lieutenant Bailey, with 14 regulars, made a show of attack on the east, while Major Bowman led a company through the town, on a line near where Main Street in Vincennes is now located, to a point north of the stockade. Charleville, a brave Creole, who was at the head of some daring fellows, by a brilliant dash got position under cover of a natural terrace at the edge of the prairie, opposite the fort's southwestern angle. Lieutenant Beverley, in whom the commander placed highest confidence, was sent to look for a supply of ammunition, and to gather up all the Frenchmen in the town who wished to join in the attack. Oncle Jason and 10 other available men went with him. They all made a great noise when they felt that the place was completely invested. Nor can we deny, much as we would like to, the strong desire for vengeance which raised those shouting voices and nerved those steady hearts to do or die in an undertaking which certainly had a desperate look. Patriotism of the purest strain those men had, and that alone would have borne them up; but the recollection of smoldering cabin homes in Kentucky, of women and children murdered and scalped, of men brave and true burned at the stake, and of all the indescribable outrages of Indian warfare incited and rewarded by the commander of the fort yonder, added to patriotism the terrible urge of that dark passion which clamors for blood to quench the fire of wrath. Not a few of those wet, half-frozen, emaciated soldiers of freedom had experienced the soul-rending shock of returning from a day's hunting in the forest to find home in ashes and loved ones brutally murdered and scalped, or dragged away to unspeakable outrage under circumstances too harrowing for description, the bare thought of which turns our blood cold, even at this distance. Now the opportunity had arrived for a stroke of retaliation. The thought was tremendously stimulating. Beverley, with the aid of Oncle Jason, was able to lead his little company as far as the church before the enemy saw him. Here a volley from the nearest angle of the stockade had to be answered, and pretty soon a cannon began to play upon the position.
"We can do better somewheres else," was Oncle Jason's laconic remark flung back over his shoulder as he moved briskly away from the spot just swept by a 6-pounder. "Come this your way, Lieutenant. I hear some of the fellers a-talkin' loud just beyond Legrasse's place. There ain't no sort o' sense a-tryin' to hit anything a-shootin' in the dark, nohow."
When they reached the thick of the town there was a strange stir in the dusky streets. Men were slipping from house to house, arming themselves and joining their neighbors. Clarke had sent an order earlier in the evening forbidding any street demonstration by the inhabitants, but he might as well have ordered the wind not to blow or the river to stand still. Oncle Jason knew every man whose outlines he could see or whose voice he heard. He called each one by name.
"Here, Roger, fall in. Come, Louis, Alphonse, Victor, Octave, venez ici. Here's the American army. Come with me."
His rapid French phrases leaped forth as if shot from a pistol, and his shrill voice, familiar to every ear in Vincennes, drew the Creole militiamen to him, and soon Beverley's company had doubled its numbers, while at the same time its enthusiasm and ability to make a noise had increased in a far greater proportion. In accordance with an order from Clarke, they now took position near the northeast corner of the stockade and began firing, although in the darkness there was but little opportunity for marksmanship. Oncle Jason had found citizens Legrasse and Bosseron, and through them Clarke's men were supplied with ammunition, of which they stood greatly in need, their powder having got wet during their long watery march. By 9 o'clock the fort was completely surrounded, and from every direction the riflemen and musketeers were pouring in volley after volley. Beverley with his men took the cover of a fence in some houses 60 yards from the stockade. Here, to their surprise, they found themselves below the line of Hamilton's cannon, which, being planted on the second floor of the fort, could not be sufficiently depressed to bear upon them. A well-directed musket fire, however, fell from the loopholes of the blockhouses, the bullets rattling merrily against the cover behind which the attacking forces lay. Beverley was thinking of Alice during every moment of all this stir and tumult. He feared that she might still be a prisoner in the fort, exposed to the very bullets that his men were discharging at every crack and cranny of those loosely constructed buildings. Should he ever see her again? Would she care for him? What would be the end of all this terrible suspense? Those remote forebodings of evils, formless, shadowy, ineffable, which have harried the lover's heart since time began, crowded all pleasant anticipations out of his mind. Clarke, in passing hurriedly from company to company around the line, stopped for a little while when he found Beverley. "Have you plenty of ammunition?" was his first inquiry.
"A mighty sight more'n we can see to shoot with,"
spoke up Oncle Jason.
"It's a right smart dad burn foolishness to be wastin' it on nothin'. Seems like to me 'at we'd better set the dasted fort afire and smoke the skunks out."
"Speak when you are spoken to, my man," said the colonel a trifle hotly, and trying by a sharp scrutiny to make him out in the gloom where he crouched.
"Ventre bleu! I'm not askin' you, Colonel Clarke, nor no other man when I shall speak. I talks whenever I gets ready, and I shoots just the same way. So ye'd better go on 'bout your business like a white man. Close up your own whopper-jawed mouth, if ye want anything shut up."
"Oh, ho, is that you, Jason? You're so little I didn't know you. Certainly, talk your whole damned underjaw off, for all I care," Clarke replied, assuming a jocose tone. Then turning to Beverley, "Keep up the firing and the noise. The fort will be ours in the morning." "What's the use of waiting till morning?" Beverley demanded with impatience. "We can tear that stockade to pieces with our hands in half an hour." "I don't think so, Lieutenant. It is better to play for the sure thing. Keep up the racket, and be ready for 'em if they rush out. We must not fail to capture the Hair Buyer General." He passed on, with something cheerful to say whenever he found a squad of his devoted men. He knew how to humour and manage those independent and undisciplined yet heroically brave fellows. What to see and hear, what to turn aside as a joke, what to insist upon with inflexible mastery, he knew by the fine instantaneous sense of genius. There were many men of Oncle Jason's cast, true as steel, but refractory as flint, who could not be dominated by any person, no matter of what stamp or office. To them an order was an insult, but a suggestion pleased and captured them. Strange as it may seem, theirs was the conquering spirit of America, the spirit which has survived every turn of progress and built up the great body of our independence. Beverley submitted to Clarke's plan with what patience he could, and all night long fired shot for shot with the best riflemen in his squad. It was a fatiguing performance, with apparently little result beyond forcing the garrison now and again to close the embrasures, thus periodically silencing the cannon. Toward the close of the night a relaxation showed itself in the shouting and firing all round the line. Beverley's men, especially the Creoles, held out bravely in the matter of noise; but even they flagged at length, their volatility simmering down to desultory bubbling and half-sleepy chattering and chafing. Beverley leaned upon a rude fence, and for a time neglected to reload his hot rifle. Of course he was thinking of Alice. He really could not think in any other direction; but it gave him a shock and a start when he presently heard her name mentioned by a little Frenchman near him on the left.
"There'll never be another such girl in Post Vincennes as Alice Roussillon," the fellow said in the soft Creole patois. "And to think of her being shot like a dog!" "And by a man who calls himself a governor, too," said another. "And as for myself, I'm in favor of burning him alive when we capture him, that's me." "Et moi aussi," chimed in a third voice. "That poor girl must be avenged. The men who shot her must die. Holy Virgin, but if Gaspard Roussillon were only here!" "But he is here. I saw him just after dark. He was in great fighting temper, that terrible man. Ouf! But I should not like to be the Colonel Hamilton and fall in the way of that Gaspard Roussillon. Morbleu, I should say not. You may leave me out of a chance like that. I shouldn't mind seeing Gaspard handle the governor, though. Ah, that would be too good. He'd pay him up for shooting Mademoiselle Alice."
Beverley could scarcely hold himself erect by the fence. The smoky, foggy landscape swam round him heavy and strange. He uttered a groan which brought Oncle Jason to his side in a hurry. "Qu'avez-vous? What's the matter?" the old man demanded with quick sympathy. "Have they hit ye? Lieutenant, are ye hurt much?" Beverley did not hear the old man's words, did not feel his kindly touch. "Alice, Alice," he murmured. "Dead, dead." "Yes," drawled Oncle Jason. "I hearn about it soon as I got inter town. It's a sorry thing, a mighty sorry thing. But mebbe I won't do a little sompin' to that." Beverley straightened himself and lifted his gun, forgetting that he had not reloaded it since firing last. He levelled it at the fort and touched the trigger. Simultaneously with his movement an embrasure opened and a cannon flashed, its roar flanked on either side by a crackling of British muskets. Some bullets struck the fence and flung splinters into Oncle Jason's face. A cannon ball knocked a ridge-pole from the roof of a house hard by, and set it whirling through the air. "Ventre bleu, et après? What the devil next?" "Better knock a feller's eyes out," the old man cried. "I ain't a-doin' nothin' to ye." He capered around, rubbing his leathery face after the manner of a scalded monkey. Beverley was struck in the breast by a flattened and spent ball that glanced from a fence picket. The shock caused him to stagger and drop his gun, but he quickly picked it up and turned to his companion. "Are you hurt, Oncle Jason?" he inquired. "Are you hurt?" "Not a bit. Just scare most into a duck feet. Thought a cannon ball had knocked my whole dang face down my throat. Nothin' but a handful of splinters in my porty countenance, makin' my head feel like a porcupine. But I sort o' thought I heard somethin' give you a diff." "Something did hit me," said Beverley, laying a hand on his breast, "but I don't think it was a bullet. They seem to be getting our range at last. Tell the men to keep well under cover. They must not expose themselves until we are ready to charge." The shock had brought him back to his duty as a leader of his little company, and with the funeral bell of all his life's happiness tolling in his agonized heart, he turned afresh to directing the fire upon the blockhouse. About this time a runner came back from Clarke with an order to cease firing and let a returning party of British scouts under Captain Lamotte re-enter the fort unharmed. A strange order it seemed to both officers and men, but it was implicitly obeyed. Clarke's genius here made another fine strategic flash. He knew that unless he let the scouts go back into the stockade they would escape by running away, and might possibly organize an army of Indians with which to succor Hamilton. But if they were permitted to go inside they could be captured with the rest of the garrison, hence his order. A few minutes passed in dead silence. Then Captain Lamotte and his party marched close by where Beverly's squad was lying concealed. It was a difficult task to restrain the Creoles, for some of them hated Lamotte. Oncle Jason squirmed like a snake while they filed past, all unaware that an enemy lurked so near. When they reached the fort, ladders were put down for them, and they began to clamber over the wall, crowding and pushing one another in wild haste. Oncle Jason could hold in no longer.
"Yeah, yeah, yeah!" he yelled. "Look out! The ladder is a-fallin' wi' ye!"
Then all the lurking crowd shouted as one man, and sure enough down came a ladder, men and all in a crashing heap. "Silence! Silence!" Beverly commanded, but he could not check the wild jeering and laughing while the bruised and frightened scouts hastily erected their ladder again, fairly tumbling over one another in their haste to ascend, and so cleared the wall, falling into the stockade to join the garrison.
"Ventre bleu!"
shrieked Uncle Jason.
"They've gone to bed. But we'll wake 'em up at the crack o' day, and give 'em a breakfast o' hot lead."
Now the fighting was resumed with redoubled spirit and noise, and when morning came, affording sufficient light to bring out the bead sights on the Kentucky rifles, the matchless marksmen in Clarke's band forced the British to close the embrasures and entirely cease trying to use their cannon. But the fight with small arms went merrily on until the middle of the forenoon. Meantime, Gaspard Roussillon had tied Francis Maisonville's hands fast and hard with the strap of his bullet pouch. "Now I'll scalp you," he said in a rumbling tone terrible to hear; and with his words out came his hunting knife from its sheath.
"Oh, have mercy, my dear Monsieur Roussillon!"
cried the panting captive.
"Have mercy!"
"Merci, yes, like your colonels, that's what you'll get. You stand by that Forbin, that scélérat, that bandit, and help him. Oh, yes, you'll get merci. Yes, the same merci that he showed to my poor Alice. Your scalp, monsieur, if you please. A small matter. It won't hurt much.
But for the sake of old friendship, Gaspard, for the sake
— Zif, poor little Alice."
"But I swear to you that I —
Tout de même, monsieur, je vais vous scalper maintenant."
In fact, he had taken off a part of Maisonville's scalp, when a party of soldiers, among whom was Maisonville's brother, a brave fellow and loyal to the American cause, were attracted by his cries and came to his rescue. Monsieur Roussillon struggled savagely, insisting upon completing his cruel performance; but he was at last overpowered, partly by brute force and partly by the pleading of Maisonville's brother, and made to desist. The big man wept with rage when he saw the bleeding prisoner protected.
"Eh bien, I'll keep what I've got," he roared, "and I'll take the rest of it next time."
He shook the tuft of hair at Maisonville and glared like a mad bull. 2 or 3 other members of Lamotte's band were captured about the same time by some of the French militiamen; and Clarke, when on his round cheering and directing his forces, discovered that these prisoners were being used as shields. Some young Creoles, gay with drink and the stimulating effect of fight, had bound the poor fellows, and were firing from behind them. Of course the commander promptly put an end to this cruelty; but they considered it exquisite fun while it lasted. It was in broad daylight, and they knew that the English in the fort could see what they were doing. "It's shameful to treat prisoners in this way," said Clarke. "I will not permit it. Shoot the next man that offers to do such a thing." One of the Creole youths, a handsome swarthy Adonis in buckskin, tossed his shapely head with a debonair smile, and said,
"To be sure, mon colonel. But what have they been doing to us? We have amused them all winter. It's but fair that they should give us a little fun now."
Clarke shrugged his broad shoulders and passed on. He understood perfectly what the people of Vincennes had suffered under Hamilton's brutal administration. At 9 o'clock an order was passed to cease firing, and a flag of truce was seen going from Clarke's headquarters to the fort. It was a peremptory demand for unconditional surrender. Hamilton refused, and fighting was fiercely resumed from behind rude breastworks meantime erected. Every loophole and opening of whatever sort was the focus into which the unerring backwood rifles sent their deadly bullets. Men began to fall in the fort, and every moment Hamilton expected an assault in force on all sides of the stockade. This, if successful, would mean inevitable massacre. Clarke had warned him of the terrible consequences of holding out until the worst should come. "For," said he in his note to the governor, "if I am obliged to storm, you may depend upon such treatment as is justly due to a murderer." Historians have wondered why Hamilton became so excited and acted so strangely after receiving the note. The phrase "justly due to a murderer" is the key to the mystery. When he read it, his heart sank and a terrible fear seized him. Justly due to a murderer. Ah, that calm, white, beautiful, girlish face dead in the moonlight, with a wisp of shining hair across it. Such treatment as is justly due to a murderer. Cold drops of sweat broke out on his forehead, and a shiver went through his body. During the truce, Clarke's weary yet still enthusiastic besiegers enjoyed a good breakfast prepared for them by the loyal dames of Vincennes. Little Adrienne Boursier was one of the handmaidens of the occasion. She brought to Beverley's squad a basket almost as large as herself, heaped with high roasted duck and warm wheaten bread, while another girl bore 2 huge jugs of coffee, fragrant and steaming hot. The men cheered them lustily and complimented them without reserve, so that before their service was over their faces were glowing with delight. And yet Adrienne's heart was uneasy and full of longing to hear something of René de Ronville. Surely some one of her friends must know something about him. And there was Oncle Jason. Doubtless he could tell her all that she wanted to know. She lingered after the food was distributed, and shyly inquired. "Ain't seed the scamp," said Oncle Jason, only he used the patois most familiar to the girl's ear. "Killed and scalped long ago, I reckon." His mouth was so full that he spoke mumblingly and with utmost difficulty. Nor did he glance at Adrienne, whose face took on as great pallor as her brown complexion could show. Beverley ate but little of the food. He sat apart on a piece of timber that projected from the rough breastwork, and gave himself over to infinite misery of spirit, which was trebled when he took Alice's locket from his bosom, only to discover that the bullet which had struck him almost entirely destroyed the face of the miniature. He gripped the dinted and twisted case, and gazed at it with the stare of a blind man. His heart almost ceased to beat, and his breath had the rustling sound we hear when a strong man dies of a sudden wound. Somehow the defacement of the portrait was taken by his soul as the final touch of fate, signifying that Alice was for ever and completely obliterated from his life. He felt a blur pass over his mind. He tried in vain to recall the face and form so dear to him. He tried to imagine her voice. But the whole universe was a vast hollow silence. For a long while he was cold, staring, rigid. Then the inevitable collapse came, and he wept as only a strong man can who is hurt to death, yet cannot die. Adrienne approached him, thinking to speak to him about René, but he did not notice her, and she went her way, leaving beside him a liberal supply of food. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice THOMPSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 20. Alice's Flag. Governor Hamilton received the note sent him by Colonel Clarke, and replied to it with curt dignity, but his heart was quaking. As a soldier he was true to the military tradition, and nothing could have induced him to surrender his command with dishonor. "Lieutenant Governor Hamilton," he wrote to Clarke, "begs leave to acquaint Colonel Clarke that he and his garrison are not disposed to be awed into any action unworthy of British subjects." "Very brave words," said Helm, when Hamilton read the note to him, "but you'll sing a milder tune before many minutes, or you and your whole garrison will perish in a bloody heap. Listen to those wild yells. Clarke has enough men to eat you all up for breakfast. You'd better be reasonable and prudent. It's not bravery to court massacre." Hamilton turned away without a word, and sent the message. But Helm saw that he was excited and could be still further wrought up. "You are playing into the hands of your bitterest enemies, the frog-eaters," he went on. "These Creoles, over whom you've held a hot poker all winter, are crazy to be turned loose upon you, and you know that they've got good cause to feel like giving you the extreme penalty. They'll give it to you without a flinch if they get the chance. You've done enough." Hamilton whirled about and glared ferociously. "Helm, what do you mean?" he demanded in a passion as hollow as it was full of desperate passion. The genial captain laughed as if he had heard a good joke. "You won't catch any fish if you swear, and you look blasphemous," he said with the lightness of humour characteristic of him at all times. "You'd better say a prayer or two. Just reflect a moment upon the awful sins you have committed, and—" A crash of coalescing volleys from every direction broke off his levity. Clarke was sending his response to Hamilton's lofty note. The guns of freedom rang out a prophecy of triumph, and the hissing bullets clucked sharply as they entered the solid logs of walls or whisked through an aperture and bowled over a man. The British musketeers returned the fire as best they could, with a courage and a stubborn coolness which Helm openly admired, although he could not hide his satisfaction whenever one of them was disabled. "Lamotte and his men are refusing to obey orders," said Farnsworth a little later, hastily approaching Hamilton, his face flushed and a gleam of hot anger in his eyes. "They're in a nasty mood. I can do nothing with them. They have not fired a shot." "Mutiny?" Hamilton demanded. "Not just that. They say they do not wish to fire on their kinsmen and friends. They are all French, you know, and they see their cousins, brothers, uncles, and old acquaintances out there in Clarke's rabble. I can do nothing with them." "Shoot the scoundrels, then." "It will be a toss-up which of us will come out on top if we try that. Besides, if we begin a fight inside, the Americans will make short work of us." "Well, what in the hell are we to do, then?" "Oh, fight, that's all," said Farnsworth apathetically, turning to a small loophole and levelling a field glass through it. "We might make a rush from the gates and stampede them," he presently added. Then he uttered an exclamation of great surprise. "There's Lieutenant Beverley out there!" he exclaimed. "You're mistaken. You're excited," Hamilton half sneeringly remarked, yet not without a shade of uneasiness in his expression. "You forget, sir." "Look for yourself. It's easily settled." And Farnsworth preferred the glass. "He's there, to a certainty, sir." "I saw Beverley an hour ago," said Helm. "I knew all the time that he'd be on hand." It was a white lie. Captain Helm was as much surprised as his captors at what he heard, but he could not resist the temptation to be annoying. Hamilton looked as Farnsworth directed, and sure enough there was the young Virginian lieutenant, standing on a barricade, his hat off, cheering his men with a superb show of zeal. Not a hair of his head was missing, so far as the glass could be relied upon to show. Oncle Jason's quick old eyes saw the gleam of the telescope tube in the loophole. "I never could shoot much," he muttered, and then a little bullet sped with absolute accuracy from his disreputable-looking rifle and shattered the object lens, just as Hamilton moved to withdraw the glass, uttering an ejaculation of intense excitement. "Such devils of marksmen!" said he, and his face was haggard. "That infernal Indian lied." "I could have told you all the time that the scalp Longhair brought to you was not Beverley's," said Helm indifferently. "I recognized Lieutenant Barlow's hair as soon as I saw it." This was another piece of off-hand romance. Helm did not dream that he was accidentally sketching a horrible truth. "Barlow's?" exclaimed Farnsworth. "Yes, Barlow's. No mistake." Two more men reeled from a porthole, the blood spinning far out of their wounds. Indeed, through every aperture in the walls the bullets were now humming like mad hornets. "Close that porthole!" stormed Hamilton. Then turning to Farnsworth, he added, "We cannot endure this long. Shut up every place large enough for a bullet to get through. Go all around, give strict orders to all. See that the men do not foolishly expose themselves. Those ruffians out there have located every crack." His glimpse of Beverley and the sinister remark of Helm had completely unmanned him before his men fell. Now it rushed upon him that if he would escape the wrath of the maddened Creoles and the vengeance of Alice's lover, he must quickly throw himself upon the mercy of Clarke. It was his only hope. He chafed inwardly, but bore himself with stern coolness. He presently sought Farnsworth, pulled him aside, and suggested that something must be done to prevent an assault and a massacre. The sounds outside seemed to forebode a gathering for a desperate rush, and in his heart he felt all the terrors of awful anticipation. "We are completely at their mercy, that is plain," he said, shrugging his shoulders and gazing at the wounded men writhing in their agony. "What do you suggest?" Captain Farnsworth was a shrewd officer. He recollected that Philip de Jean, Justice of Detroit, was on his way down the Wabash from that post, and probably near at hand with a flotilla of men and supplies. Why not ask for a few days of truce? It could do no harm, and if agreed to, might be their salvation. Hamilton jumped at the thought, and forthwith drew up a note which he sent out with a white flag. Never before in all his military career had he been so comforted by a sudden cessation of fighting. His soul would grovel in spite of him. Alice's cold face now had Beverley's beside it in his field of inner vision, a double assurance of impending doom, it seemed to him. There was a short delay in the arrival of Colonel Clarke's reply, hastily scrawled on a bit of soiled paper. The request for a truce was flatly refused, but the note closed thus: "If Mr. Hamilton is desirous of a conference with Colonel Clarke, he will meet him at the church with Captain Helms." The spelling was not very good, and there was a redundancy of capital letters. Yet Hamilton understood it all, and it was very difficult for him to conceal his haste to attend the proposed conference. But he was afraid to go to the church. The thought chilled him. He could not face Father Beret, who would probably be there. And what if there should be evidences of the funeral? What if— He shuddered and tried to break away from the vision in his tortured brain. He sent a proposition to Clarke to meet him on the esplanade before the main gate of the fort, but Clarke declined, insisting upon the church. And thither he at last consented to go. It was an immense brace to his spirit to have Helm beside him during that walk, which, although but 80 yards in extent, seemed to him a matter of leagues. On the way he had to pass near the new position taken up by Beverley and his men. It was a fine test of nerve when the lieutenant's eyes met those of the governor. Neither man permitted the slightest change of countenance to betray his feelings. In fact, Beverley's face was as rigid as marble; he could not have changed it. But with Oncle Jason it was a different affair. He had no dignity to preserve, no fine military bearing to sustain, no terrible tug of conscience, no paralyzing grip of despair on his heart. When he saw Hamilton going by, bearing himself so superbly, it affected the French volatility in his nature to such an extent that his tongue could not be controlled.
Va-t'en, bête, forban, meurtrier! Skin out from here! Beast! Robber! Murderer!
he cried in his keen screech-owl voice.
I'll get that scalp of yourn afore sundown, see if I don't! Ye ornery gal-killer and hair-buyer!
The blood in Hamilton's veins caught no warmth from these remarks, but he held his head high and passed stolidly on, as if he did not hear a word. Helm turned the tail of an eye upon Oncle Jason and gave him a droll, quizzical wink of approval. In response, the old man, with grotesque solemnity, drew his buck-horn-handled knife, licked its blade, and returned it to its sheath, a bit of pantomime well understood and keenly enjoyed by the onlooking Creoles.
Putois, coquin! they jeered. Goujat! Poltron!
Beverley heard the taunting racket, but did not realize it, which was well enough, for he could not have restrained the bitter effervescence. He stood like a statue, gazing fixedly at the now receding figure, the lofty, cold-faced man in whom centred his hate of hates. Clarke had requested him to be present at the conference in the church; but he declined, feeling that he could not meet Hamilton and restrain himself. Now he regretted his refusal, half wishing that— No, he could not assassinate an enemy under a white flag. In his heart he prayed that there would be no surrender, that Hamilton would reject every offer. To storm the fort and revel in butchering its garrison seemed the only desirable thing left for him in life. Father Beret was indeed present at the church, as Hamilton had dreaded, and the two duellists gave each other a rapier-like eye-thrust. Neither spoke, however, and Clarke immediately demanded a settlement of the matter in hand. He was brusque and imperious to a degree, apparently rather anxious to repel every peaceful advance. It was a laconic interview, crisp as autumn ice and bitter as gall-berries. Colonel Clarke had no respect whatever for Hamilton, to whom he had applied the imperishable adjective Herr Buyer General. On the other hand, Governor Hamilton, who felt keenly the disgrace of having to equalize himself officially and discuss terms of surrender with a rough backwoodsman, could not conceal his contempt of Clarke. The 5 men of history, Hamilton, Helm, Hay, Clarke, and Bowman, were not distinguished diplomats. They went at their work rather after the hammer and tongs fashion. Clarke bluntly demanded unconditional surrender. Hamilton refused. They argued the matter. Helm put in his oar, trying to soften the situation, as was his custom on all occasions, and received from Clarke a stinging reprimand, with the reminder that he was nothing but a prisoner on parole, and had no voice at all in settling the terms of surrender. "I release him, sir," said Hamilton. "He is no longer a prisoner. I am quite willing to have Captain Helm join freely in our conference." "And I refuse to permit his acceptance of your favor," responded Clarke. "Captain Helm, you will return with Mr. Hamilton to the fort and remain his captive until I free you by force. Meantime, hold your tongue." Father Beret, suave-looking and quiet, occupied himself at the little altar, apparently altogether indifferent to what was being said; but he lost not a word of the talk. "Quia et aureus audiendi audiat," he inwardly repeated, smiling blandly. "Gaudete in illa die et exultate." Hamilton rose to go. Deep lines of worry creased his face; but when the party had passed outside he suddenly turned upon Clarke and said, "Why do you demand impossible terms of me?" "I will tell you, sir," was the stern answer, in a tone in which there was no mercy or compromise. "I would rather have you refuse. I desire nothing so much as an excuse to wreak full and bloody vengeance on every man in that fort who has engaged in the business of employing savages to scalp brave, patriotic men and defenseless women and children. The cries of the widows and the fatherless on our frontiers require the blood of the Indian partisans at my hands. If you choose to risk the massacre of your garrison to save those despicable red-handed partisans, have your pleasure. What you have done you know better than I do. I have a duty to perform. You may be able to soften its nature. I may take it into my head to send for some of our bereaved women to witness my terrible work and see that it is well done, if you insist upon the worst." Major Hay, who was Hamilton's Indian agent, now with some difficulty clearing his throat, spoke up. "Pray, sir," said he, "who is it that you call Indian partisans?" "Sir," replied Clarke, seeing that his words had gone solidly home, "I take Major Hay to be one of the principals." This seemed to strike Hay with deadly force. Clarke's report says that he was pale and trembling, scarcely able to stand, and that Hamilton blushed, and I observed was much affected at his behavior. Doubtless, if the doughty American commander had known more about the governor's feelings just then, he would have added that an awful fear, even greater than the Indian agent's, did more than anything else to congest the veins in his face. The parties separated without reaching an agreement, but the end had come. The terror in Hamilton's soul was doubled by a wild scene enacted under the walls of his fort; a scene which, having no proper place in this story, strong as its historical interest unquestionably is, must be but outlined. A party of Indians, returning from a scalping expedition in Kentucky and along the Ohio, was captured on the outskirts of the town by some of Clarke's men, who proceeded to kill and scalp them within full view of the beleaguered garrison, after which their mangled bodies were flung into the river. If the British commander needed further wine of dread to fill his cup withal, it was furnished by an ostentatious marshalling of the American forces for a general assault. His spirit broke completely, so that it looked like a godsend to him when Clarke finally offered terms of honorable surrender, the consummation of which was to be postponed until the following morning. He accepted promptly, appending to the articles of capitulation the following reasons for his action: the remoteness from succor, the state and quantity of provisions, etc., unanimity of officers and men in its expediency, the honourable terms allowed, and lastly, the confidence in a generous enemy. Confidence in a generous enemy? Abject fear of the vengeance just wreaked upon his savage emissaries would have been the true statement. Beverley read the paper when Clarke sent for him, but he could not join in the extravagant delight of his fellow officers and their brave men. What did all this victory mean to him? Hamilton to be treated as an honourable prisoner of war, permitted to strut forth from the fort with his sword at his side, his head up, the scalp buyer, the murderer of Alice. What was patriotism to the crushed heart of a lover? Even if his vision had been able to pierce the future and realize the splendour of Anglo-Saxon civilization which was to follow that little triumph at Vincennes, what pleasure could it have afforded him? Alice, Alice, only Alice. No other thought had influence, save the recurring surge of desire for vengeance upon her murderer. And yet that night Beverley slept, and so forgot his despair for many hours, even dreamed a pleasant dream of home, where his childhood was spent, of the stately old house on the breezy hilltop, overlooking a sunny plantation, with a little river lapsing and shimmering through it. His mother's dear arms were around him, her loving breath stirred his hair, and his stalwart grey-headed father sat on the veranda comfortably smoking his pipe, while away in the wide fields the negroes sang at the plough and the hoe. Sweeter and sweeter grew the scene, softer the air, tenderer the blending sounds of the water murmur, leaf rustle, bird song, and slave song, until hand in hand he wandered with Alice in greening groves where the air was trembling with the ecstasy of spring. A young officer awoke him with an order from Clarke to go on duty at once with Captains Worthington and Williams, who under Colonel Clarke himself were to take possession of the fort. Mechanically he obeyed. The sun was far up, shining between clouds of a leaden watery hue by the time everything was ready for the important ceremony. Beside the main gate of the stockade 2 companies of patriots under Bowman and McCarty were drawn up as guards, while the British garrison filed out and was taken in charge. This bit of formality ended, Governor Hamilton, attended by some of his officers, went back into the fort, and the gate was closed. Clarke now gave orders that preparations be made for hauling down the British flag and hoisting the young banner of liberty in its place, when everything should be ready for a salute of 13 guns from the captured battery. Helm's round face was beaming. Plainly it showed that his happiness was supreme. He dared not say anything, however, for Clarke was now all sternness and formality. It would be dangerous to take any liberties. But he could smile and roll his quid of tobacco from cheek to cheek. Hamilton and Farnsworth, the latter slightly wounded in the left arm, which was bandaged, stood together somewhat apart from their fellow officers, while preliminary steps for celebrating their defeat and capture were in progress. They looked forlorn enough to have excited deep sympathy under fairer conditions. Outside the fort the Creoles were beginning a noise of jubilation. The rumor of what was going to be done had passed from mouth to mouth until every soul in the town knew and thrilled with expectancy. Men, women, and children came swarming to the sight, and to hear at close range the crash of the cannon. They shouted, in a scattering way at first, then the tumult grew swiftly to a solid rolling tide that seemed beyond all comparison with the population of Vincennes. Hamilton heard it and trembled inwardly, afraid lest the mob should prove too strong for the guard. One leonine voice roared distinctly high above the noise. It was a sound familiar to all the Creoles, that bellowing shout of Gaspard Roussillon's. He was roaming around the stockade, having been turned back by the guard when he tried to pass through the main gate. "They shut me out!" he bellowed furiously. "I am Gaspard Roussillon, and they shut me out! Me! Zif! Me voici! Je vais entrer immédiatement, moi!" He attracted but little attention, however. The people and the soldiery were all too excited by the special interest of the occasion, and too busy with making a racket of their own for any individual, even the great Roussillon, to gain their eyes or ears. He in turn scarcely heard the tumult they made, so self-centred were his burning thoughts and feelings. A great occasion in Vincennes, and he, Gaspard Roussillon, not recognized as one of the large factors in it. Ah, no, never! And he strode along the wall of the stockade, turning the corners and heavily shambling over the inequalities till he reached the postern. It was not fastened, someone having passed through just before him.
"Zif!"
he ejaculated, stepping into the area and shaking himself after the manner of a dusty mastiff.
"C'est moi, Gaspard Roussillon."
His massive underjaw was set like that of a vice, yet it quivered with rage, a rage which was more fiery condensation of self-approval than anger. Outside, the shouting, singing, and huzzas gathered strength and volume until the sound became a hoarse roar. Clarke was uneasy. He had overheard much of a threatening character during the siege. The Creoles were, he knew, justly exasperated, and even his own men had been showing a spirit which might easily be fanned into a dangerous flame of vengeance. He was very anxious to have the formalities of taking possession of the fort over with, so that he could the better control his forces. Sending for Beverley, he assigned him to the duty of hauling down the British flag and running up that of Virginia. It was an honour of no doubtful sort, which under different circumstances would have made the lieutenant's heart glow. As it was, he proceeded without any sense of pride or pleasure, moving as a mere machine in performing an act significant beyond any other done west of the mountains, in the great struggle for American independence and the control of American territory. Hamilton stood a little way from the foot of the tail flagpole, his arms folded on his breast, his chin slightly drawn in, his brows contracted, gazing steadily at Beverley while he was untying the halyard which had been wound round the pole's base about 3 feet above the ground. The American troops in the fort were disposed so as to form 3 sides of a hollow square facing inward. Oncle Jason, serving as the ornamental extreme of one line, was conspicuous for his outlandish garb and unmilitary bearing. The silence inside the stockade offered a strong contrast to the tremendous roar of voices outside. Clarke made a signal, and at the tap of a drum, Beverley shook the ropes loose and began to lower the British colours. Slowly, the bright emblem of earth's mightiest nation crept down in token of the fact that a handful of backwoodsmen had won an empire by a splendid stroke of pure heroism. Beverley detached the flag, and saluting, handed it to Colonel Clarke. Hamilton's breast heaved, and his iron jaws tightened their pressure until the lines of his cheeks were deep furrows of pain. Father Beret, who had just been admitted, quietly took a place at one side near the wall. There was a fine, warm, benignant smile on his old face, yet his powerful shoulders drooped as if weighted down with a heavy load. Hamilton was aware when he entered, and instantly the scene of their conflict came into his memory with awful vividness, and he saw Alice lying outstretched, stark and cold, the shining strand of hair fluttering across her pallid cheek. Her ghost overshadowed him. Just then there was a bird-like movement, a wing-like rustle, and a light figure flitted swiftly across the area. All eyes were turned upon it. Hamilton recoiled, as pale as death, half lifting his hands as if to ward off a deadly blow, and then a gay flag was flung out over his head. He saw before him the girl he had shot, but her beautiful face was not waxen now, nor was it cold or lifeless. The rich red blood was strong under the brown yet delicate skin, the eyes were bright and brave, the cherry lips, slightly apart, gave a glimpse of pearl-white teeth, and the dimples, those roguish dimples, twinkled sweetly. Colonel Clarke looked on in amazement, and in spite of himself in admiration. He did not understand. The sudden incident bewildered him. But his virile nature was instantly and wholly charmed. Something like a breath of violets shook the tenderest chords of his heart. Alice stood firmly, a statue of triumph, her right arm outstretched, holding the flag high above Hamilton's head, and close by her side the little hunchback Jean was posed in his most characteristic attitude, gazing at the banner which he himself had stolen and kept hidden for Alice's sake, and because he loved it. There was a dead silence for some moments, during which Hamilton's face showed that he was ready to collapse. Then the keen voice of Oncle Jason broke forth. "Vive Georges Washington! Vive la bannière d'Alice Roussillon!" He sprang to the middle of the area and flung his old cap high in air, with a shrill war-whoop.
"Hist it! Hist it! Hissez la bannière de Mademoiselle Alice Roussillon! Voilà que c'est glorieuse, cette bannière-là! Hist it! Hist it!"
He was dancing with a rickety liveliness, his goatish legs and shrivelled body giving him the look of an emaciated satyr. Clarke had been told by some of his Creole officers the story of how Alice raised the flag when Helm took the fort, and how she snatched it from Hamilton's hand, as it were, and would not give it up when he demanded it. The whole situation pretty soon began to explain itself, as he saw what Alice was doing. Then he heard her say to Hamilton, while she slowly swayed the rippling flag back and forth,
"I said, as you will remember, Monsieur le Gouverneur, that when you next should see this flag, I should wave it over your head. Well, look, I am waving it. Vive la République! Vive George Washington! What do you think of it, Monsieur le Gouverneur?"
The poor little hunchback Jean took off his cap and tossed it in rhythmical emphasis, keeping time to her words. And now from behind the hollow square came a mighty voice.
"C'est moi, Gaspard Roussillon. Me voici, messieurs."
There was a spirit in the air which caught from Alice a thrill of romantic energy. The men in the ranks and the officers in front of them felt a wave of irresistible sympathy sweep through their hearts. Her picturesque beauty, her fine temper, the fitness of the incident to the occasion had an instantaneous power which moved all men alike. "Raise her flag! Run up the young lady's flag!" some one shouted, and then every voice seemed to echo the words. Clarke was a young man of noble type, in whose veins throbbed the warm chivalrous blood of the Cavaliers. A waft of the suddenly prevailing influence bore him also quite off his feet. He turned to Beverley, and said, "Do it! It will have a great effect. It is a good idea. Get the young lady's flag, and her permission to run it up." Before he finished speaking, indeed at the first glance he saw that Beverley, like Hamilton, was white as a dead man; and at the same time it came to his memory that his young friend had confided to him, during the awful march through the prairie wilderness, a love story about this very Alice Roussillon. In the worry and stress of the subsequent struggle, he had forgotten the tender basis upon which Beverley had rested his excuse for leaving Vincennes. Now it all reappeared in justification of what was going on. It touched the romantic core of his southern nature. "I say, Lieutenant Beverley," he repeated, "beg the young lady's permission to use her flag upon this glorious occasion. Or shall I do it for you?" There were no miracles in those brave days, and the strain of life with its terrible realities braced all men and women to meet sudden explosions of surprise, whether of good or bad effect, with admirable equipoise. But Beverley's trial, it must be admitted, was extraordinary. Still he braced himself quickly, and his whole expression changed when Clarke moved to go to Alice. For he realized now that it was indeed Alice in flesh and blood standing there, the centre of admiration, filling the air with her fine magnetism and crowning a great triumph with her beauty. He gave her a glad flashing smile, as if he had just discovered her, and walked straight to her, his hands extended. She was not looking toward him, but she saw him and turned to face him. Hers was the advantage, for she had known for some hours of his presence in Vincennes, and had prepared herself to meet him courageously and with maidenly reserve. There is no safety, however, when love lurks. Neither Beverley nor Alice was as much agitated as Hamilton, yet they both forgot what he remembered, that 100 grim frontier soldiers were looking on. Hamilton had his personal and official dignity to sustain, and he fairly did it, under what a pressure of humiliating and surprising circumstances we can fully comprehend. Not so with the two young people, standing as it were in a suddenly bestowed and incomparable happiness, on the verge of a new life, each to the other an unexpected, unhoped-for resurrection from the dead. To them there was no universe, save the illimitable expanse of their love. In that moment of meeting, all that they had suffered on account of love was transfused and poured forth. A glowing libation for love's sake, a flood before which all barriers broke. Father Beret was looking on with a strange fire in his eyes, and what he feared would happen did happen. Alice let the flag fall at Hamilton's feet, when Beverley came near her smiling that great glad smile, and with a joyous cry leaped into his outstretched arms. Jean snatched up the fallen banner and ran to Colonel Clarke with it. 2 minutes later it was made fast, and the halyard began to squeak through the rude pulley at the top of the pole. Up, up climbed the gay little emblem of glory, while the cannon crashed from the embrasures of the blockhouse hard by, and outside the roar of voices redoubled. 13 guns boomed the salute, though it should have been 14, the additional one for the great Northwestern Territory, that day annexed to the domain of the young American Republic. The flag went up at old Vincennes, never to come down again, and when it reached its place at the top of the staff, Beverly and Alice stood side by side looking at it, while the sun broke through the clouds and flashed on its shining folds, and love unabashed glorified the two strong young faces. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice THOMPSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 21. Some transactions in scalps. History would be a very orderly affair could the dry-as-dust historians have their way, and doubtless it would be thrillingly romantic at every turn if the novelists were able to control its current. Fortunately, neither one nor the other has much influence, and the result in the long run is that most novels are shockingly tame, while the large body of history is loaded down with picturesque incidents which if used in fiction would be thought absurdly romantic and improbable. Were our simple story of old Vincennes a mere fiction, we should hesitate to bring in the explosion of a magazine at the fort with a view to sudden confusion and, by that means, distracting attention from our heroine while she betakes herself out of a situation which, although delightful enough for a blessed minute, has quickly become an embarrassment quite unendurable. But we simply adhere to the established facts in history. Owing to some carelessness there was indeed an explosion of 26 6-pound cartridges, which made a mighty roar and struck the newly installed garrison into a heap, so to say, scattering things terribly and wounding 6 men, among them Captains Bowman and Worthington. After the thunderous crash came a momentary silence, which embraced both the people within the fort and the wild crowd outside. Then the rush and noise were indescribable. Even Clarke gave way to excitement, losing command of himself and, of course, of his men. There was a stampede toward the main gate by one wing of the troops in the hollow square. They literally ran over Beverly and Alice, flinging them apart and jostling them hither and yonder without mercy. Of course the turmoil quickly subsided. Clarke and Beverly got hold of themselves and sang out their peremptory orders with excellent effect. It was like oil on raging water. The men obeyed in a straggling way, getting back into ranks as best they could.
"Ventre bleu!"
squeaked Oncle Jason.
"If I didn't think the whole world had busted into 1,000,000 pieces!"
He was jumping up and down not 3 feet from Beverly's toes, waving his cap excitedly.
"But wasn't I scared? Ya, ya, ya! Vive la bannière d'Alice Roussillon! Vive Georges Washington!"
Hearing Alice's name caused Beverly to look around. Where was she? In the distance he saw Father Beret hurrying to the spot where some of the men burnt and wounded by the explosion were being stripped and cared for. Hamilton stood like a statue. He appeared to be the only cool person in the fort. "Where is Alice? Miss Roussillon? Where did Miss Roussillon go?" Beverly exclaimed, staring around like a lost man. "Where is she?"
"Dunno,"
said Oncle Jason, resuming his habitual expression of droll dignity.
"She shot past me jest as that thing busted loose, and she went like her hummin' bird, skitch! Jest that way, and I didn't see her no more. 'Cause I was skeert mighty nigh inter 7 feets. 'Spect that 'splosion blowed her clean away. Ventre bleu! Never was so plumb out'n breath and dead crazy weak a bein' afeard."
"Lieutenant Beverly!" roared Clarke in his most commanding tone. "Go to the gate and settle things there. That mob outside is trying to break in." The order was instantly obeyed, but Beverly had relapsed. Once more his soul groped in darkness, while the whole of his life seemed unreal, a wavering, misty, hollow dream. And yet his military duty was all real enough. He knew just what to do when he reached the gate. "Back there at once!" he commanded, not loudly, but with intense force. "Back there!" This to the inward surging wedge of excited outsiders. Then to the guard. "Shoot the first man who crosses the line."
"Zif, me voici! Moi, Gaspard Roussillon! Laissez-moi passer, messieurs!"
A great body hurled itself frantically past Beverly and the guard, going out through the gateway against the wall of the crowd, bearing everything before it and shouting.
Back, fools! You'll all be killed! The powder is on fire! Thief, run!"
Wild as a March hare, he bristled with terror and foamed at the mouth. He stampeded the entire mass. There was a wild howl, a rush in the other direction followed, and soon enough the esplanade and all the space back to the barricades and beyond were quite deserted. Alice was not aware that a serious accident had happened. Naturally, she thought the great rattling, crashing noise of the explosion a mere part of the spectacular show. When the rush followed, separating her and Beverley, it was a great relief to her in some way, for a sudden recognition of the boldness of her action in the little scene just ended came over her and bewildered her. An impulse sent her running away from the spot where it seemed to her she had invited public derision. The terrible noises all around her were, she now fancied, but the jeering and hooting of rude men who had seen her unmaidenly forwardness. With a burning face she flew to the postern and slipped out, once more taking the course which had become so familiar to her feet. She did not slacken her speed until she reached the Boursier cabin, where she had made her home since the night when Hamilton's pistol ball struck her. The little domicile was quite empty of its household, but Alice entered and flung herself into a chair, where she sat quivering and breathless when Adrienne, also much excited, came in, preceded by a stream of patois that sparkled continuously.
"The fort is blown up!" she cried, gesticulating in every direction at once, her petite figure comically dilated with the importance of her statement. 100 men are killed and the powder is on fire. She pounced into Alice's arms, still talking as fast as her tongue could vibrate, changing from subject to subject without rhyme or reason, her prattle making its way by skips and shies until what was really uppermost in her sweet little heart disclosed itself. "And oh, Alice, René has not come yet." She plunged her dusky face between Alice's cheek and shoulder. Alice hugged her sympathetically and said, "But René will come. I know he will, dear." "Oh, but do you know it? Is it true? Who told you? When will he come? Where is he? Tell me about him." Her head popped up from her friend's neck, and she smiled brilliantly through the tears that were still sparkling on her long black lashes. "I didn't mean that I had heard from him, and I don't know where he is. But they always come back." "You say that because your man, because Lieutenant Beverley has returned. It is always so. You have everything to make you happy, while I Again her eyes spilled their shower, and she hid her face in her hands, which Alice tried in vain to remove. "Don't cry, Adrienne. You didn't see me crying." "No, of course not. You didn't have a thing to cry about. Lieutenant Beverley told you just where he was going, and just what. But think, Adrienne, only think of the awful story they told, that he was killed, that Governor Hamilton had paid Longhair for killing him and bringing back his scalp. Oh, dear, just think! And I thought it was true." "Well, I'd be willing to think and believe anything in the world if René would come back," said Adrienne, her face now uncovered, showing pitiful lines of suffering. "Oh, Alice, Alice! And he never, never will come." Alice exhausted every device to cheer, encourage, and comfort her. Adrienne had been so good to her when she lay recovering from the shock of Hamilton's pistol bullet, which, although it came near killing her, made no serious wound, only a bruise, in fact. It was one of those fortunate accidents or providentially ordered interferences which once in a while save a life. The stone disc worn by Alice chanced to lie exactly in the missile's way, and while it was not broken, the ball, already somewhat checked by passing through several folds of Father Beret's garments, flattened itself upon it with a shock which somehow struck Alice senseless. Here again history in the form of an ancient family document, a letter written in 1821 by Alice herself, gives us the curious brace of incidents, to wit, the breaking of the miniature on Beverley's breast by a British musket ball, and the stopping of Hamilton's bullet over Alice's heart by the Indian charm stone. "Which shows the goodness of God," the letter goes on, and also seems to sustain the Indian legend concerning the stone that whoever might wear it could not be killed. Unquestionable, Mr. Hamilton's shot, which was aimed at poor dear old Father Beret, would have pierced my heart, but for that charm stone. As for my locket, it did not, as some have reported, save Fitzhugh's life when the musket ball was stopped.
The ball was so spent that the blow was only hard enough to spoil temporarily the face of the miniature, which was afterwards restored fairly well by an artist in Paris. When it did actually save Fitzhugh's life was out on the Illinois plain. The savage Longhair, peace to his memory, worked the miracle of restoring to me. Here a fold in the paper has destroyed a line of the writing. The letter is a sacred family paper, and there is not justification for going farther into its faded and, in some parts, almost obliterated writing. But so much may pass into these pages as a pleasant authentication of what otherwise might be altogether too sweet a double nut for the critic's teeth to crack. While Adrienne and Alice were still discussing the probability of René de Ronville's return, M. Roussillon came to the door. He was in search of Madame, his wife, whom he had not yet seen. He gathered the two girls in his mighty arms, tousling them with rough tenderness. Alice returned his affectionate embrace, and told him where to find Madame Roussillon, who was with Dame Godert, probably at her house.
"Nobody killed,"
he said in answer to Alice's inquiry about the catastrophe at the fort.
"Some of 'em hurt and burnt a little. Great big scare about nearly nothing. Zif, my children, you should have seen me quiet things. I put out my hands this way, comme ça, pouf! It was all over. The people went home."
His gestures indicated that he had borne back an army with open hands. Then he chucked Adrienne under the chin with his finger, and added in his softest voice,
"I saw somebody's lover the other day, over yonder, in the Indian village. He spoke to me about somebody. Eh, ma petite, que voulez-vous dire?"
"Oh, Papa Roussillon, we were just talking about René," cried Alice. "Have you seen him?"
"I saw you, you little minx, jumping into a man's arms right under the eyes of a whole garrison. Bah! I could not believe it was my little Alice."
He let go a grand guffaw which seemed to shake the cabin's walls. Alice blushed cherry red. Adrienne, too bashful to inquire about René, was trembling with anxiety. The truth was not in Gaspard Roussillon just then, or if it was it stayed in him, for he had not seen René de Ronville. It was his generous desire to please and to appear opulent of knowledge and sympathy that made him speak. He knew what would please Adrienne, so why not give her at least a delicious foretaste? Surely when a thing was so cheap one need not be so parsimonious as to withhold a mere anticipation. He was off before the girls could press him into details, for indeed he had none.
"There now, what did I tell you?" cried Alice when the big man was gone. "I told you René would come. They always come back."
Father Beret came in a little later. As soon as he saw Alice he frowned and began to shake his head; but she only laughed, and imitating his hypocritical scowl, yet fringing it with a twinkle of merry lines and dimples, pointed a taper finger at him and exclaimed,
"You bad, bad man! Why did you pretend to me that Lieutenant Beverley was dead? What sinister ecclesiastical motive prompted you to describe how Longhair scalped him?"
"Ah, father!" The priest laid a broad hand over her saucy mouth.
"Something or other seems to have excited you mightily, ma fille. You are a trifle impulsively inclined to day."
"Yes, Father Beret. Yes, I know, and I am ashamed. My heart shrinks when I think of what I did. But I was so glad, such a grand joy came all over me when I saw him, so strong and brave and beautiful, coming toward me, smiling that warm, glad smile, and holding out his arms. Ah! When I saw all that, when I knew for sure that he was not dead, why, father, I just had to. I couldn't help it."
Father Beret laughed in spite of himself, but quickly managed to resume his severe countenance.
"Ta, ta!" he exclaimed. "It was a bold thing for a little girl to do."
"So it was, so it was. But it was also a bold thing for him to do, to come back after he was dead and scalped and look so handsome and grand. I'm ashamed and sorry, father. But I'm afraid I might do it again if well, I don't care if I did. So there now."
"But what in the world are you talking about?"
interposed Adrienne. Evidently they were discussing a most interesting matter of which she knew nothing, and that did not suit her feminine curiosity.
"Tell me."
She pulled Father Beret's sleeve.
"Tell me, I say."
It is probable that Father Beret would have pretended to betray Alice's source of mingled delight and embarrassment, had not the rest of the Boursier household returned in time to break up the conversation. A little later Alice gave Adrienne a vividly dramatic account of the whole scene.
Ah, mon Dieu! exclaimed the petite brunette after she had heard the exciting story. That was just like you, Alice. You always do superb things. You were born to do them. You shoot Captain Farnsworth, you wound Lieutenant Barlow, you climb onto the fort and set up your flag, you take it down again and run away with it, you get shot and you do not die, you kiss your lover right before a whole garrison. Bon Dieu, if I could but do all those things!"
She clasped her tiny hands before her and added rather dejectedly,
"But I couldn't kiss a man in that way."
Late in the evening news came to Roussillon Place, where Gaspard Roussillon was once more happy in the midst of his little family, that the Indian Longhair had just been brought to the fort and would be shot on the following day. A scouting party captured him as he approached the town bearing at his belt the fresh scalp of a white man. He would have been killed forthwith, but Clarke, who wished to avoid a repetition of the savage vengeance meted out to the Indians on the previous day, had given strict orders that all prisoners should be brought into the fort, where they were to have a fair trial by court-martial. Both Helm and Beverley were at Roussillon Place, the former sipping wine and chatting with Gaspard, the latter of course hovering around Alice, after the manner of a hungry bee around a particularly sweet and deliciously refractory flower. It was raining slowly, the fine drops coming straight down through the cold, still February air. But the two young people found it pleasant enough for them on the veranda, where they walked back and forth, making fair exchange of the exciting experiences which had befallen them during their long separation. Between the lines of these mutual recitals sweet, fresh echoes of the old story went from heart to heart, an Amabean love-bout like that of spring birds calling tenderly back and forth in the blooming Maytime woods. Both Captain Helm and Monsieur Roussillon were delighted to hear of Longhair's capture and certain fate, but neither of them regarded the news as of sufficient importance to need much comment. They did not think of telling Beverley and Alice. Jean, however, lying awake in his little bed, overheard the conversation, which he repeated to Alice next morning with great circumstantiality. Having the quick insight bred of frontier experience, Alice instantly caught the terrible significance of the dilemma in which she and Beverley would be placed by Longhair's situation. Moreover, something in her heart arose with irresistible power demanding the final, the absolute human sympathy and gratitude. No matter what deeds Longhair had committed that were evil beyond forgiveness, he had done for her the all-atoning thing. He had saved Beverley and sent him back to her. With a start and a chill of dread she thought, "What if it is already too late?" But her nature could not hesitate. To feel the demand of an exigency was to act. She snatched a wrap from its peg on the wall and ran as fast as she could to the fort. People who met her flying along wondered, staring after her, what could be urging her so that she saw nobody, checked herself for nothing, ran splashing through the puddles in the street, gazing ahead of her, as if pursuing some flying object from which she dared not turn her eyes. And there was indeed a call for her utmost power of flight if she would be of any assistance to Longhair, who even then stood bound to a stake in the fort's area, while a platoon of riflemen, those unerring shots from Kentucky and Virginia, were ready to make a target of him at a range of but 20 yards. Beverley, greatly handicapped by the fact that the fresh scalp of a white man hung at Longhair's belt, had exhausted every possible argument to avert or mitigate the sentence promptly spoken by the court-martial of which Colonel Clarke was the ruling spirit. He had succeeded barely to the extent of turning the mode of execution from tomahawking to shooting. All the officers in the fort approved killing the prisoner, and it was difficult for Colonel Clarke to prevent the men from making outrageous assaults upon him, so exasperated were they at the sight of the scalp. Oncle Jason proved to be one of the most refractory among those who demanded tomahawking and scalping as the only treatment due Longhair. The repulsive savage stood up before them, stolid, resolute, defiant, proudly flaunting the badge which testified to his horrible efficiency as an emissary of Hamilton's. It had been left in his belt by Clarke's order as the best justification of his doom.
"Help me hack his damned head," Oncle Jason pleaded. I just hankers to chop a hole into it. And besides, I want his scalp to hang up with mine and that of the Indian what scalped me. He kicked me in the ribs, the stinking varmint."
Beverley pleaded eloquently and well, but even the genial Major Helm laughed at his sentiment of gratitude to a savage who at best but relented at the last moment, for Alice's sake, and concluded not to sell him to Hamilton. It is due to the British commander to record here that he must positively, and with what appeared to be high sincerity, denied the charge of having offered rewards for the taking of human scalps. He declared that his purposes and practices were humane, and that while he did use the Indians as military allies, his orders to them were that they must forego cruel modes of warfare and refrain from savage outrage upon prisoners. Certainly the weight of contemporary testimony seems overwhelmingly against him, but we enter his denial. Longhair himself, however, taunted him with accusations of unfaithfulness in carrying out some very inhuman contracts, and to add a terrible sting, volunteered the statement that poor Barlow's scalp had served his turn in the place of Beverley's. With conditions so hideous to contend against, Beverley of course had no possible means of succouring the condemned savage.
"Him a kicking your ribs clean into ye, and a making ye run the gauntlet, and here ye are a trying to save his life,"
whined Oncle Jason.
"Why, man, I thought ye had some sentiments. Dast his Indian liver. I can feel them kicks what he guv me till yet. Ventre bleu, que diable voulez-vous?"
Clarke simply pushed Beverley's pleadings aside as not worth a moment's consideration. He easily felt a fine bit of gratitude at the bottom of it all, but there was too much in the other side of the balance. Justice, the discipline and confidence of his little army, and the claim of the women and children on the frontier demanded firmness in dealing with a case like Longhair's. "No, no," he said to Beverley, "I would do anything in the world for you, Fitz, except to swerve an inch from duty to my country and the defenseless people down yonder in Kentucky. I can't do it. There's no use to press the matter further. The die is cast. That brute's got to be killed, and killed dead. Look at him. Look at that scalp. I'd have him killed if I dropped dead for it the next instant." Beverley shuddered. The argument was horribly convincing, and yet somehow the desire to save Longhair overbore everything else in his mind. He could not cease his efforts. It seemed to him as if he were pleading for Alice herself. Captain Farnsworth, strange to say, was the only man in the fort who leaned to Beverley's side, but he was reticent, doubtless feeling that his position as a British prisoner gave him no right to speak, especially when every lip around him was muttering something about infamous scalp buyers and Indian partisans, with whom he was prominently counted by the speakers. As Clarke had said, the die was cast. Longhair bound to a stake, the scalp still dangling at his side, grimly faced his executioners, who were eager to fire. He appeared to be proud of the fact that he was going to be killed. "One thing I can say of him," Helm remarked to Beverley, "he's the grandest specimen of the animal. I might say the brute, man that I ever saw, red, white, or black. Just look at his body and limbs. Those muscles are perfectly marvelous. He saved my life, and I must stand here and see him murdered," the young man replied with intense bitterness. It was all he could think, all that he could say. He felt inefficient and dejected, almost desperate. Clarke himself, not willing to cast responsibility upon a subordinate, made ready to give the fatal order. Turning to Longhair first, he demanded of him, as well as he could in the Indian dialect, of which he had a smattering, what he had to say at his last moment. The Indian straightened his already upright form, and by a strong bulging of his muscles snapped the thongs that bound him. Evidently he had not tried thus to free himself. It was rather a spasmodic expression of savage dignity and pride. One arm and both his legs still were partially confined by the bonds, but his right hand he lifted with a gesture of immense self-satisfaction, and pointed at Hamilton. "Indian brave, white man coward," he said, scowling scornfully. "Longhair tell truth, white man lie, damn." Hamilton's countenance did not change its calm, cold expression. Longhair gazed at him fixedly for a long moment, his eyes flashing most concentrated hate and contempt. Then he tore the scalp from his belt and flung it with great force straight toward the captive governor's face. It fell short, but the look that went with it did not, and Hamilton recoiled. At that moment Alice arrived. Her coming was just in time to interrupt Clarke, who had turned to the waiting platoon with the order of death on his lips. She made no noise, save the fluttering of her skirts, and her loud and rapid panting on account of her long hard run. She sprang before Longhair and faced the platoon. "You cannot, you shall not kill this man!" she cried in a voice loaded with excitement. "Put away those guns!" Woman never looked more thrillingly beautiful to man than she did just then to all those rough, stern backwoodsmen. During her flight her hair had fallen down, and it glimmered like soft sunlight around her face. Something compelling flashed out of her eyes, an expression between a triumphant smile and a ray of irresistible beseechment. It took Colonel Clarke's breath when he turned and saw her standing there and heard her words. "This man saved Lieutenant Beverley's life," she presently added, getting better control of her voice, and sending into it a thrilling timbre. "You shall not harm him. You must not do it." Beverley was astounded when he saw her, the thing was so unexpected, so daring, and done with such high imperious force. Still it was but a realization of what he had imagined she would be upon occasion. He stood gazing at her, as did all the rest, while she faced Clarke and the platoon of riflemen. To hear his own name pass her quivering lips in that tone and in that connection seemed to him a consecration. "Would you be more savage than your Indian prisoner?" she went on. "Less grateful than he for a life saved? I did him a very small service once, and in memory of that he saved Lieutenant Beverley's life, because she faltered for a single breath, then added clearly and with magnetic sweetness, because Lieutenant Beverley loved me, and because I loved him. This Indian Longhair showed a gratitude that could overcome his strongest passion. You white men should be ashamed to fall below his standard." Her words went home. It was as if the beauty of her face, the magnetism of her lissom and symmetrical form, the sweet fire of her eyes, and the passionate appeal of her voice gave what she said a new and irresistible force of truth. When she spoke of Beverley's love for her, and declared her love for him, there was not a manly heart in all the garrison that did not suddenly beat quicker and feel a strange, sweet waft of tenderness. A mother somewhere, a wife, a daughter, a sister, a sweetheart, called through that voice of absolute womanhood. "Beverley, what can I do?" muttered Clarke, his bronze face as pale as it could possibly become. "Do?" thundered Beverley. "Do? You cannot murder that man. Hamilton is the man you should shoot. He offered large rewards, he inflamed the passions and fed the love of rum and cupidity of poor wild men like the one standing yonder. Yet you take him prisoner and treat him with distinguished consideration. Hamilton offered a large sum for me taken alive, a smaller one for my scalp. Longhair saved me. You let Hamilton stand yonder in perfect safety while you shoot the Indian. Shame on you, Colonel Clarke. Shame on you if you do it." Alice stood looking at the stalwart commander while Beverley was pouring forth his torrent of scathing reference to Hamilton, and she quickly saw that Clarke was moved. The moment was ripe for the finishing stroke. They say it is genius that avails itself of opportunity. Beverley knew the fight was won when he saw what followed. Alice suddenly left Longhair and ran to Colonel Clarke, who felt her warm, strong arms loop round him for a single point of time, never to be effaced from his memory. Then he saw her kneeling at his feet, her hands upstretched, her face a glorious prayer, while she pleaded the Indian's cause, and won it. Doubtless, while we all rather feel that Clarke was weak to be thus swayed by a girl, we cannot quite blame him. Alice's flag was over him. He had heard her history from Beverley's cunning lips. He actually believed that Hamilton was the real culprit, and besides he felt not a little nauseated with executing Indians. A good excuse to have an end of it all did not go begging. But Longhair was barely gone over the horizon from the fort, as free and as villainous a savage as ever trod the earth, when a discovery made by Oncle Jason caused Clarke to hate himself for what he had done. The old scout picked up the scalp which Longhair had flung at Hamilton and examined it with odious curiosity. He had lingered on the spot with no other purpose than to get possession of that ghastly relic. Since losing his own scalp, the subject of crown locks had grown upon his mind until its fascination was irresistible. He studied the hair of every person he saw, as a physiognomist studies faces. He held the gruesome thing up before him, scrutinizing it with the expression of a connoisseur who had discovered on a grimy canvas the signature of an old master.
"Sac bleu!"
he presently broke forth.
"Well, I'll be! Looky here, George Clarke. Come here and look. Ye've been sold again. Take a squint, if ye please."
Colonel Clarke, with his hands crossed behind him, his face thoughtfully contracted, was walking slowly to and fro a little way off. He turned about when Oncle Jason spoke. "What now, Jason?"
"A mighty heap right now, that's what. Come here and let me show ye. Ye're a fine sort of idjit, now ain't ye?"
The two men walked toward each other and met. Oncle Jason held up the scalp with one hand, pointing at it with the index finger of the other.
"This here scalp come offen René de Ronville's head."
"And who is he?"
"Who's he? Ye may well ax that. He was a Frenchman. He was a fine young feller o' this town. He killed a corporal o' Hamilton's, and tucked o'er the woods a month or two ago. Hamilton offered a lot o' money for him or his scalp, and Longhair went in for gettin' it. Now ye knows the whole racket. An' ye lets that Injun go. An' that same Injun he mighty nigh kicked my ribs inter my stomach."
Oncle Jason's feelings were visible and audible, but Clarke could not resent the contempt of the old man's looks and words. He felt that he deserved far more than he was receiving. Nor was Oncle Jason wrong. René de Ronville never came back to little Adrienne Boursier, although, being kept entirely ignorant of her lover's fate, she waited and dreamed and hoped throughout more than 2 years, after which there is no further record of her life. Clarke, Beverley, and Oncle Jason consulted together, and agreed among themselves that they would hold profoundly secret the story of the scalp. To have made it public would have exasperated the Creoles and set them violently against Clarke, a thing heavy with disaster for all his future plans. As it was, the release of Longhair caused a great deal of dissatisfaction and mutinous talk. Even Beverley now felt that the execution ordered by the commander ought to have been sternly carried out. A day or two later, however, the whole dark affair was closed forever by a bit of confidence on the part of Oncle Jason, when Beverley dropped into his hut one evening to have a smoke with him. The rain was over, the sky shone like one vast luminary, with a nearly full moon and 1,000 stars reinforcing it. Up from the south poured one of those balmy accidental wind floods, sometimes due in February on the Wabash, full of tropical dream hints, yet edged with a winter chill that smacks of treachery. Oncle Jason was unusually talkative. He may have had a draught of liquor. At all events, Beverley had little room for a word.
"Well, being as it's twixt us, as his bosom friends," the old fellow presently said, "I'll just show you somepin porty."
He pricked the wick of a lamp and took down his bunch of scalps.
"I have been a-addin' one more to keep company o' mine and t'others."
He separated the latest acquisition from the rest of the wisp, and added with a heinous chuckle,
"This'n's Longhair's."
And so it was. Beverley knocked the ashes from his pipe and rose to go.
"When they kicks your Oncle Jason's ribs," the old man added, "they jest as well lay down and give up, for he's going to salivate 'em."
Then, after Beverley had passed out of the cabin, Oncle Jason chirruped after him,
"Mebbe ye'd better not tell little Alice. The poor little girl have had worry enough."
End of chapter 21. Chapters 22 and 23 of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice THOMPSON. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 22. Clarke advises Alice. A few days after the surrender of Hamilton, a large boat, the Willing, arrived from Kaskaskia. It was well manned and heavily armed. Clarke fitted it out before beginning his march, and expected it to be of great assistance to him in the reduction of the fort, but the high waters and the floating driftwood delayed its progress, so that its disappointed crew saw Alice's flag floating bright and high when their eyes first looked upon the dull little town from far down the swollen river. There was much rejoicing, however, when they came ashore and were enthusiastically greeted by the garrison and populace. A courier whom they had picked up on the Ohio came with them. He bore dispatches from Governor Henry of Virginia to Clarke, and a letter from Beverley from his father. With them appeared also Simon Kenton, greatly to the delight of Oncle Jason, who had worried much about his friend since their last Freden, as he called it, with the Indians. Meantime, an expedition under Captain Helm had been sent up the river with the purpose of capturing a British flotilla from Detroit. Gaspard Roussillon, immediately after Clarke's victory, thought he saw a good opening favorable to festivity at the river house, for which he soon began to make some of his most ostentatious preparations. Fate, however, as usual in his case, interfered. Fate seemed to like pulling the big Frenchman's ear now and again, as if to remind him of the fact, which he was apt to forget, that he lacked somewhat of omnipotence.
Zif, je vais donner un banquet à tout le monde, moi,
he cried, hustling and bustling hither and thither. A scout from up the river announced the approach of Philippe de Jean with his flotilla richly laden, and what little interest may have been gathering in the direction of Monsieur Roussillon's festal proposition vanished like the flame of a lamp in a puff of wind when this news reached Colonel Clarke and became known in town. Beverley and Alice sat together in the main room of the Roussillon cabin. You could scarcely find them separated during those happy days, and Alice was singing to the soft tinkle of a guitar, a Creole ditty with a merry smack in its scarcely intelligible nonsense. She knew nothing about music beyond that Monsieur Roussillon, a jack of all trades, had been able to teach her. A few simple chords to accompany her songs, picked up at haphazard. But her voice, like her face and form, irradiated witchery. It was sweet, firm, deep, with something haunting in it, the tone of a hermit thrush, marvellously pure and clear, carried through a gay strain like the mocking-bird's. Of course Beverley thought it divine; and when a message came from Colonel Clarke bidding him report for duty at once, he felt an impulse toward mutiny of the rankest sort. He did not dream that a military expedition could be on hand; but upon reaching headquarters the first thing he heard was, "Report to Captain Helm. You are to go with him up that river and intercept a British force. Move lively, Helm is waiting for you, probably." There was no time for explanations. Evidently Clarke expected neither questions nor delay. Beverley's love of adventure and his patriotic desire to serve his country came to his aid vigorously enough. Still, with Alice's love song ringing in his heart, there was a cord pulling him back from duty to the sweetest of all life's joys. Helm was already at the landing, where a little fleet of boats was being prepared. 1,000 things had to be done in short order. All hands were stimulated to highest exertion with the thought of another fight. Swivels were mounted in boats, ammunition and provisions stored abundantly, flags hoisted, and oars dipped. Never was an expedition of so great importance more swiftly organized and set in motion, nor did one ever have a more prosperous voyage or completer triumph. Philippe de Jean, Justice of Detroit, with his men, boats, and rich cargo, was captured easily, with not a shot fired, nor a drop of blood spilled in doing it. If Alice could have known all this before it happened, she would probably have saved herself from the mortification of a rebuke administered very kindly, but not the less thoroughly, by Colonel Clarke. The rumour came to her, a brilliant Creole rumour, duly inflated, that an overwhelming British force was descending the river, and that Beverley, with a few men not sufficient to base the expedition on a respectable forlorn hope, would be sent to meet them. Her nature, as was its wont, flared into high indignation. What right had Colonel Clarke to send her lover away to be killed just at a time when he was all the whole world to her? Nothing could be more outrageous. She would not suffer it to be done. Not she. Colonel Clarke greeted her pleasantly when she came somewhat abruptly to him, where he was directing a squad of men at work making some repairs in the picketing of the fort. He did not observe her excitement until she began to speak, and then it was noticeable only, and not very strongly, in her tone. She forgot to speak English, and her French was Greek to him. "I am glad to see you, mademoiselle," he said rather inconsequently, lifting his hat and bowing with rough grace while he extended his right hand cordially. "You have something to say to me? Come with me to my office." She barely touched his fingers.
Yes, I have something to say to you. I can tell it here," she said, speaking English now with softest Creole accent. "I came to—" It was not so easy as she had imagined it would be to utter what she had in mind. Clarke's steadfast, inscrutable eyes, kindly yet not altogether sympathetic, met her own and beat them down. Her voice failed. He offered her his arm, and gravely said, "We will go to my office. I see that you have some important communication to make. There are too many ears here." Of a sudden she felt like running home. Somehow the situation broke upon her with a most embarrassing effect. She did not take Clarke's arm, and she began to tremble. He appeared unconscious of this, and probably was, for his mind had a fine tangle of great schemes in it just then. But he turned toward his office, and bidding her follow him, walked away in that direction. She was helpless. Not the slightest trace of her usual brilliant self-assertion was at her command. Saving the squad of men sawing and hacking, digging and hammering, the fort appeared as deserted as her mind. She stood gazing after Clarke. He did not look back, but strode right on. If she would speak with him she must follow. It was a surprise to her, for heretofore she had always had her own way, even if she found it necessary to use force. And where was Beverley? Where was the garrison? Colonel Clarke did not seem to be at all concerned about the approach of the British. And yet those repairs— perhaps he was making ready for a desperate resistance. She did not move until he reached the door of his office, where he stopped and stepped aside, as if to let her pass in first. He even lifted his hat, then looked a trifle surprised when he saw that she was not near him, frowned slightly, changed the frown to a smile, and said, lifting his voice so that she felt a certain imperative meaning in it, "Did I walk too fast for you? I beg your pardon, mademoiselle." He stood waiting for her, as a father waits for a lagging, wilful child. "Come, please," he added, "if you have something to say to me. My time just now is precious. I have a great deal to do." She was not of a nature to retreat under fire, and yet the panic in her breast came very near mastering her will. Clarke saw a look in her face which made him speak again. "I assure you, mademoiselle, that you need not feel embarrassed. You can rely upon me to—" She made a gesture that interrupted him. At the same time she almost ran toward him, gathering in breath, as one does who is about to force out a desperately resisting and riotous thought. The strong, grave man looked at her with a full sense of her fascination, and at the same time he felt a vague wish to get away from her, as if she were about to cast unwelcome responsibility upon him. "Where is Lieutenant Beverley?" she demanded, now close to Clarke, face to face, and gazing straight into his eyes. "I want to see him." Her tone suggested intense excitement. She was trembling visibly. Clarke's face changed its expression. He suddenly recalled to mind Alice's rapturous public greeting of Beverley on the day of the surrender. He was a cavalier, and it did not agree with his sense of high propriety for girls to kiss their lovers out in the open air before a gazing army. True enough, he himself had been hoodwinked by Alice's beauty and boldness in the matter of long hair. He confessed this to himself mentally, which may have strengthened his present disapproval of her personal inquiry about Beverley. At all events he thought she ought not to be coming into the stockade on such an errand. "Lieutenant Beverley is absent acting under my orders," he said with perfect respectfulness, yet in a tone suggesting military finality. He meant to set an indefinite yet effective rebuke in his words. "Absent?" she echoed. "Gone? You sent him away to be killed? You had no right, you—" "Miss Roussillon," said Clarke, becoming almost stern, "you had better go home and stay there. Young girls oughtn't to run around hunting men in places like this." His blunt severity of speech was accompanied by a slight frown and a gesture of impatience. Alice's face blazed red to the roots of her sunny hair. The color ebbed, giving place to a pallor like death. She began to tremble, and her lips quivered pitifully, but she braced herself and tried to force back the choking sensation in her throat. "You must not misconstrue my words," Clarke quickly added. "I simply mean that men will not rightly understand you. They will form impressions very harmful to you. Even Lieutenant Beverley might not see you in the right light." "What do you mean?" she gasped, shrinking from him, a burning spot reappearing under the dimpled skin of each cheek. "Pray, miss, do not get excited.
There is nothing to make you cry." He saw tears shining in her eyes. "Beverley is not in the slightest danger. All will be well, and he'll come back in a few days. The expedition will be but a pleasure trip. Now you go home. Lieutenant Beverley is amply able to take care of himself. And let me tell you, if you expect a good man to have great confidence in you, stay home and let him hunt you up instead of you hunting him. A man likes that better." It would be impossible to describe Alice's feelings as they just then rose like a whirling storm in her heart. She was humiliated, she was indignant, she was abashed. She wanted to break forth with a tempest of denial, self-vindication, resentment. She wanted to cry with her face hidden in her hands. What she did was to stand helplessly gazing at Clarke with 2 or 3 bright tears on either cheek, her hands clenched, her eyes flashing. She was going to say some wild thing, but she did not. Her voice lodged fast in her throat. She moved her lips, unable to make a sound. 2 of Clarke's officers relieved the situation by coming up to get orders about some matter of town government, and Alice scarcely knew how she made her way home. Every vein in her body was humming like a bee when she entered the house and flung herself into a chair. She heard Madame Roussillon and Father Beret chatting in the kitchen, whence came a fragrance of broiling buffalo steak besprinkled with garlic. It was Father Beret's favourite dish, wherefore his tongue ran freely, almost as freely as that of his hostess, and when he heard Alice come in he called gaily to her through the kitchen door. "Come here, ma fille, and lend us old folks your appetite. Nous avons une tranche à la bordelaise."
"I am not hungry," she managed to say. "You can eat it without me."
The old man's quick ears caught the quaver of trouble in her voice, much as she tried to hide it. A moment later he was standing beside her with his hand on her head. "What is the matter now, little one?" he tenderly demanded. "Tell your old father." She began to cry, laying her face in her crossed arms, the tears gushing, her whole frame a-quiver and heaving great sobs. She seemed to shrink like a trodden flower. It touched Father Beret deeply. He suspected that Beverley's departure might be the cause of her trouble, but when presently she told him what had taken place in the fort he shook his head gravely and frowned. "Colonel Clarke was right, my daughter," he said in a short silence, "and it is time for you to ponder well upon the significance of his words. You can't always be a wilful, headstrong little girl, running everywhere and doing just as you please. You have grown to be a woman in stature. You must be one in fact. You know I told you at first to be careful how you acted with—"
"Father, dear old father!"
she cried, springing from her seat and throwing her arms around his neck.
"Have I appeared forward and unwomanly? Tell me, father, tell me. I did not mean to do anything."
"Quietly, my child. Don't give way to excitement." He gently put her from him and crossed himself, a habit of his when suddenly perplexed, then added, "You have done no evil, but there are proprieties which a young woman must not overstep. You are impulsive, too impulsive, and it will not do to let a young man see that you—"
"Father, I understand,"
she interrupted, and her face grew very pale. Madame Roussillon came to the door, flushed with stooping over the fire, and announced that the steak was ready.
"Bring the wine, Alice," she added, "a bottle of Bordeaux."
She stood for a breath or two, her red hands on her hips, looking first at Father Beret, then at Alice.
"Quarrelling again about the romances?" she inquired. "She's been at it again? She's found him again?"
"Yes," said Father Beret, with a queer dry smile.
"More romance.
Yes, she's been at it again.
Now fetch the Bordeaux, little one."
The following days were cycles of torture to Alice. She grovelled in the shadow of a great dread. It seemed to her that Beverley could not love her, could not help looking upon her as a poor, wild, foolish girl, unworthy of consideration. She magnified her faults and crudities, she paraded before her inner vision her recent improprieties, as they had been disclosed to her, until she saw herself a sort of monstrosity at which all mankind was gazing with disgust. Life seemed dry and shrivelled, a mere jaundiced shadow, while her love for Beverley took on a new growth, luxuriant, all-embracing, uncontrollable. The ferment of spirit going on in her breast was the inevitable process of self-recognition which follows the terrible unfolding of the passion flower in a nature almost absolutely simple and unsophisticated. Vincennes held its breath while waiting for news from Helm's expedition. Every day had its nimble yet wholly imaginary account of what had happened, skipping from mouth to mouth and from cabin to cabin. The French folk ran hither and thither in the persistent rain, industriously improving the dramatic interest of each groundless report. Alice's disturbed imagination revelled in the kaleidoscopic terrors conjured up by these swift changes of the form and colour of the stories "from the front," all of them more or less tragic. To-day the party is reported as having been surprised and massacred to a man. To-morrow there had been a great fight, many killed, the result in doubt. Next day the British are defeated, and so on. The volatile spirit of the Creoles fairly surpassed itself in ringing the changes on stirring rumours. Alice scarcely left the house during the whole period of excitement and suspense. Like a wounded bird, she withdrew herself from the light and noisy chatter of her friends, seeking only solitude and crepuscular nooks in which to suffer silently. Jean brought her every picturesque bit of the ghastly gossip, thus heaping coals on the fire of her torture. But she did not grow pale and thin. Not a dimple fled from cheek or chin, not a ray of saucy sweetness vanished from her eyes. Her riant health was unalterable. Indeed, the only change in her was a sudden ripening and mellowing of her beauty, by which its colours, its lines, its subtle undercurrents of expression were spiritualized, as if by some powerful clarifying process. Tremendous is the effect of a soul surprised by passion and brought hard up against an opposing force, which dashes it back upon itself with a flare and explosion of self-revealment. Nor shall we ever be able to foretell just how small a circumstance, just how slight an exigency, will suffice to bring on the great change. The shifting of a smile to the gloom of a frown, the snap of a string on the lute of our imagination, just at the point when a rich melody is culminating, the waving of a hand, a vanishing face, any eclipse of tender, joyous expectation, dashes a nameless sense of despair into the soul. And a young girl's soul! Who shall uncover its sacred depths of sensitiveness or analyze its capacity for suffering under such a stroke? On the 5th day of March, back came the victorious Helm, having surrounded and captured 7 boats, richly loaded with provisions and De Jean's whole force. Then again the little Creole town went wild with rejoicing. Alice heard the news and the noise, but somehow there was no response in her heart. She dreaded to meet Beverley. Indeed, she did not expect him to come to her. Why should he? Monsieur Roussillon, who had volunteered to accompany Helm, arrived in a mood of unlimited proportions so far as expressing self-admiration and abounding delight was concerned. You would have been sure that he had done the whole deed single-handed and brought the flotilla and captives to town on his back. But Oncle Jason for once held his tongue, being too disgusted for words at not having been permitted to fire a single shot. What was the use of going to fight and simply meeting and escorting down the river a lot of non-combatants? There is something inscrutably delightful about a girl's way of thinking one thing and doing another. Perversity, thy name is maidenhood, and maidenhood, thy name is delicious in consequence. When Alice heard that Beverley had come back, safe, victorious, to be greeted as one of the heroes of an important adventure, she immediately ran to her room, frightened and full of vague, shadowy dread, to hide from him, yet feeling sure that he would not come. Moreover, she busied herself with the preposterous task of putting on her most attractive gown, the buff brocade which she wore that evening at the river house, how long ago it seemed, when Beverley thought her the queenliest beauty in the world; and she was putting it on so as to look her prettiest while hiding from him. It is a toss-up where happiness will make its nest. The palace, the hut, the great lady's garden, the wild lass's bower, skip here, alight there, the secret of it may never be told. And love and beauty find lodgment, by the same inexplicable route, in the same extremes of circumstances. The wind bloweth where it listeth, finding many a matchless flower and many a ravishing fragrance in the wildest nooks of the world. No sooner did Beverley land at the little wharf than, rushing to his quarters, he made a hasty exchange of water-soaked apparel for something more comfortable, and then bolted in the direction of Roussillon Place. Now Alice knew by the beating of her heart that he was coming. In spite of all she could do, trying to hold on hard and fast to her doubt and gloom, a tide of rich sweetness began to course through her heart and break in splendid expectation from her eyes, as they looked through the little unglazed window toward the fort. Nor had she long to wait. He came up the narrow wet street, striding like a tall actor in the height of a melodrama, his powerful figure erect as an Indian's, and his face glowing with the joy of a genuine, impatient lover, who is proud of himself because of the image he bears in his heart. When Alice flung wide the door, which was before Beverley could cross the veranda, she had quite forgotten how she had gowned and bedecked herself, and so, without a trace of self-consciousness, she flashed upon him a full-blown flower, to his eyes the loveliest that ever opened under heaven. Gaspard Roussillon, still overflowing with the importance of his part in the capture of Dijon, came puffing homeward just in time to see a man at the door holding Alice a tiptoe in his arms. "Zeph!" he cried as he pushed open the little front gate of the yard. "En voilà assez! Vogue la galère!" The two forms disappeared within the house as if moved by his roaring voice. The letter to Beverley from his father was somewhat disturbing. It bore the tidings of his mother's failing health. This made it easier for the young lieutenant to accept from Clarke the assignment to duty with a party detailed for the purpose of escorting Hamilton, Farnsworth, and several other British officers to Williamsburg, Virginia. It also gave him a most powerful assistance in persuading Alice to marry him at once, so as to go with him on what proved to be a delightful wedding journey through the great wilderness to the Old Dominion. Spring's verdure burst abroad on the sunny hills as they slowly went their way. The mating birds sang in every blooming brake and grove by which they passed, and in their joyous hearts they heard the bubbling of love's eternal fountain. 23. And so it ended. Our story must end here, because at this point its current flows away forever from old Vincennes, and it was only of the post on the Wabash that we set out to make a record. What befell Alice and Beverley after they went to Virginia we could go on to tell, but that would be another story. Suffice it to say, they lived happily ever after, or at least somewhat beyond 70, and left behind them a good name and numerous descendants. How Alice found out her family in Virginia we are not informed, but after a lapse of some years from the date of her marriage, there appears in one of her letters a reference to an estate inherited from her Tarleton ancestors, and her name appears in old records signed in full, Alice Tarleton Beverley. A descendant of hers still treasures the locket with its broken miniature and battered crest which won Beverley's life from Longhair the Savage. Beside it, as carefully guarded, is the Indian charm stone that stopped Hamilton's bullet over Alice's heart. The rapiers have somehow disappeared, and there is a tradition in the Tarleton family that they were given by Alice to Gaspard Roussillon, who, after Madame Roussillon's death in 1790, went to New Orleans, where he stayed a year or two before embarking for France, whither he took with him the beautiful pair of Colichemard and Jean the Hunchback. Oncle Jason lived in Vincennes many years after the war was over, but he died at Natchez, Mississippi, when 93 years old. He said, with almost his last breath, that he couldn't shoot very well, even in his best days, but that he had, upon various occasions, "just kind of happened to hit a Injun in the left eye." They used to tell a story as late as General Harrison's stay in Vincennes, about how Oncle Jason buried his collection of scalps with great funeral solemnity, as his part of the celebration of peace and independence about the year 1784. Good old Father Beret died suddenly soon after Alice's marriage and departure for Virginia. He was found lying face downward on the floor of his cabin. Near him, on a smooth part of a puncheon, were the mildewed fragments of a letter which he had been arranging as if to read its contents. Doubtless it was the same letter brought to him by René de Ronville as recorded in an early chapter of our story. The fragments were gathered up and buried with him. His dust lies under the present church of St. Xavier, the dust of as noble a man and as true a priest as ever sacrificed himself for the good of humanity. In after years Simon Kenton visited Beverley and Alice in their Virginia home. To his dying day he was fond of describing their happy and hospitable welcome and the luxuries to which they introduced him. They lived in a stately white mansion on a hill overlooking a vast tobacco plantation, where hundreds of negro slaves worked and sang by day and frolicked by night. Their oldest child was named Fitzhugh Gaspard. Kenton died in 1836. There remains but one little fact worth recording before we close the book. In the year 1800, on the 4th of July, a certain leading French family of Vincennes held a patriotic reunion, during which a little old flag was produced and its story told. Someone happily proposed that it be sent to Mrs. Alice Tarleton Beverley with a letter of explanation, and in profound recognition of the glorious circumstances which made it the true flag of the great Northwest. And so it happened that Alice's little banner went to Virginia, and is still preserved in an old mansion not very far from Monticello. But it seems likely that the Wabash Valley will soon again possess the precious relic. The marriage engagement of Miss Alice Beverley to a young Indiana officer, distinguished for his patriotism and military ardor, has been announced at the old Beverley homestead on the hill, and the high contracting parties have planned that the wedding ceremony shall take place under the famous little flag, on the anniversary of Clarke's capture of Post Vincennes. When the bride shall be brought to her new home on the banks of the Wabash, the flag will come with her; but Oncle Jason will not be on hand with his falsetto shout, "Vive la bannière d'Alice Roussillon! Vive George Washington!" End of chapters 22 and 23. End of Alice of Old Vincennes by Maurice THOMPSON. Recorded by Celine Major.